quiet Christmas night, snow falling softly, and the world wrapped in a blanket of peace. But sometimes, the stillness of winter hides more than just the cold. In the quiet, shadows stir, and the festive glow gives way to something darker. Welcome to Mystara Shadows. Tonight, we'll unravel haunting stories from the season of joy, stories that blur the line between holiday magic and holiday mystery. Get comfortable, let the calm of the night surround you, and prepare to journey into tales that will chill your spirit as you drift into sleep. Because even on Christmas, not everything is as it seems. The first time I heard it, I was lying awake in the vestry, listening to the wind claw at the stone walls of the church. Sleep had been elusive ever since I'd taken the job as caretaker. The silence of the place wasn't soothing like I thought it would be. It was heavy, stifling, as if the weight of the building's age and history pressed against me. The cold didn't help. No matter how many blankets I piled on, the damp air seemed to seep into my bones, making the nights long and restless. I heard the music just after midnight. Faint at first, almost imperceptible beneath the groaning timbers and the distant hum of the wind. But then it grew louder, more distinct, a slow, mournful melody that seemed to rise from the very foundation of the church. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, echoing through the nave. The flashlight on the table was cold in my hand as I stepped out into the corridor. The narrow beam of light swept across the stone walls, casting shadows that twisted and shifted with each movement. The air was colder here, sharper, and the music seemed to grow stronger as I moved closer to the nave. It wasn't a melody I recognized, though it carried the weight of something old, something sacred. Each note hung in the air, reverberating through the vast space of the church, filling it with an eerie, unshakable presence. I pushed open the door to the nave, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The music was louder now, unmistakable, but the source was nowhere to be seen. The pews stretched out before me, their polished wood gleaming faintly in the dim light. Above, the stained glass windows were dark, their vibrant colors muted by the night. My breath fogged in the frigid air as I moved toward the organ at the far end of the nave, its massive pipes rising like sentinels against the stone wall. The music faltered as I approached, the notes becoming softer, more distant, until they faded completely, leaving only silence. The organ was just as I'd left it, its keys untouched, its pedals and stops gathering dust. I ran my fingers across the cold surface, half expecting the music to start again, but there was nothing. Just the faint echo of my footsteps and the distant howling of the wind outside. I stood there for a long moment, the flashlight trembling in my hand, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination. The church was old, full of drafts and creaks and echoes. It wasn't impossible for the wind to mimic the sound of music, was it? But deep down, I didn't believe that. The melody had been too deliberate, too precise. It hadn't come from the wind. It had come from somewhere within the church. The next morning, the music felt like a bad memory, something distant and dreamlike that I could almost dismiss. Almost. The church was quiet as I made my rounds, inspecting the nave, the choir loft, the bell tower. Everything was as it should be, though the air felt colder than usual, the shadows darker, more pronounced. I lingered near the organ, running my fingers over the dusty keys, but it remained silent. The day passed slowly, the silence of the church pressing down on me like a physical weight. I tried to busy myself with small tasks, sweeping the floors, polishing the pews, checking the old hymnals for damage. But my mind kept drifting back to the music. I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been a dream, that it was still lingering somewhere just out of reach, waiting for the right moment to return. That night it did. I had just settled into bed, the heavy wool blankets pulled tightly around me, when I heard it again. The same melody, soft and mournful, drifting through the church like a ghost. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the corridor, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The music was louder this time, clearer, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the stone walls, the wooden beams, the very air itself. I followed the sound into the nave, the cold air biting at my skin as I moved closer to the organ. The music grew louder with each step, the notes vibrating in my chest, filling me with a strange mix of awe and dread. When I reached the organ, I saw it. The keys were moving, slowly, deliberately, as if guided by invisible hands. They pressed down one by one, the pedals below rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The pipes above shuddered with each note, their hollow voices blending into a haunting harmony that echoed through the empty church. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, unable to move, unable to think, every muscle in my body frozen with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music stopped. The keys stilled, the pipes fell silent, and the church was plunged into a suffocating quiet. I stood there, my heart pounding, the flashlight shaking in my grip, unable to look away from the organ. The air around me felt heavy, charged with something unseen, something alive. I stepped back slowly, my footsteps echoing through the nave, and turned toward the vestry. As I reached the door, I heard it again. Not music this time, but a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. It was coming from the organ, soft and rhythmic, like a voice trying to form words. I didn't wait to hear more. I slammed the door shut and retreated to my cot, pulling the blankets over my head like a child hiding from the dark. I didn't sleep that night. The church felt colder the next day, as if the events of the night had leached whatever warmth was left from its walls. The air was heavier, too, filled with a palpable tension that made every sound, every creak of the wood, every distant groan of the stone, feel deliberate, intentional. I moved through the nave slowly, carefully, my breath fogging in the frigid air as I checked every corner for signs of disturbance. The organ sat in its usual place, still and silent, its keys dusted over once more. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it, not after what I'd seen. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the music, the moving keys, the whispers, had been nothing more than the result of exhaustion and an overactive mind. But deep down, I knew better. The melody hadn't been random. It had been deliberate, purposeful, as if it were trying to convey something just beyond my understanding. And those whispers, they hadn't been words exactly, but they had weight, like an echo of something spoken in a language too old to recognize. As I swept the nave, my eyes kept drifting toward the stained glass windows. They were breathtaking, works of art that depicted scenes from the life of Christ and the saints. But that morning, they felt different. The colors were muted, their vibrant reds and blues dulled to a sickly gray. And the figures, they seemed off, their faces blurred, their postures rigid, unnatural. I stood in front of one depicting the Nativity, the infant Christ cradled in the arms of his mother, and felt a shiver run through me. The mother's face was wrong. Her eyes, usually gentle and serene, were dark and hollow, her mouth twisted into something that looked more like a scream than a smile. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and turned away. It was just the light, I told myself. The weak winter sun was playing tricks on my eyes, casting shadows that distorted the images. But the unease lingered, crawling under my skin, making the back of my neck prickle. I found the journal later that day, tucked away in the small library near the vestry. It was old, its leather cover cracked and faded, its pages yellowed with age. At first, I thought it was just another relic, one of many forgotten in the church's endless storage spaces. But as I flipped through the pages, I realized it was something else entirely. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink faded but still legible. The entries weren't dated, but they spoke of events that could only have happened decades ago. The writer, a previous caretaker, described strange occurrences within the church, unexplained noises, flickering lights, cold spots that seemed to follow him, no matter where he went. The final entries grew more frantic, detailing the same melody I had heard, the same whispers. He wrote of a choir, of voices singing in perfect harmony, though the church had been empty for years. One passage stood out, the words underlined so heavily that the paper had torn in places. The carol is not for us. It is a calling, a summoning. They come to finish what was begun. I slammed the journal shut, my hands trembling, and shoved it back onto the shelf. My mind raced with questions, with half-formed theories that made my stomach twist. Who were they? What had been begun? And what did the melody have to do with it? That night, the music returned. It started softly, so faint I almost missed it, but it grew quickly, filling the nave with its haunting melody. It was louder this time, more forceful, the notes reverberating through the stone walls, shaking the floor beneath my feet. I stood in the doorway to the nave, the flashlight in my hand trembling, and watched as the keys of the organ began to move again. They pressed down in perfect sequence, the pedals below rising and falling, the pipes above vibrating with each note. But this time, it wasn't just the organ. The choir loft above was filled with shadows, faint, flickering shapes that moved in time with the music. They weren't solid, not exactly, but they had form, a suggestion of bodies swaying as if caught in the rhythm of the melody. I felt my chest tighten, my breath catching in my throat as I watched them, their movements slow and deliberate, like dancers performing a ritual I couldn't understand. The whispers returned, louder now, weaving through the music, adding a layer of unease to the already suffocating atmosphere. They weren't words, not in any language I knew, but they carried meaning, an intent that made my skin crawl. It was as if the church itself was speaking, its voice ancient and full of despair. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my body refusing to move even as my mind screamed at me to run. The shadows in the choir loft grew darker, more defined, their movements more erratic. The music reached a crescendo, the notes crashing together in a discordant, jarring cacophony that made my ears ring. And then, all at once, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the music. It was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The shadows in the loft were gone, the organ still, its keys and pedals motionless. The whispers had faded, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the distant creak of the old wood. I stumbled back into the vestry, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The air in the room was freezing, the faint smell of candle wax and dust sharp in my nose. I sank onto the cot, pulling the blankets around me, and tried to steady my racing heart. The journal's words echoed in my mind. It is a calling, a summoning. I didn't sleep that night. By the third night, the church no longer felt like a place of sanctuary. It was something else now, something ancient and unknowable. The air inside had grown colder, heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that lingered at the back of my throat. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, stretching across the walls even when the lights stayed still. The silence between the melodies was suffocating, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. The journal hadn't left my mind. The frantic scrawl, the descriptions of the carol, the strange whispers, and the references to them. Whoever wrote it had known exactly what I was feeling, what I was seeing. I tried to tell myself it was all coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. The melody, the shadows, the impossible movements of the organ. This was no trick of the mind. It was real, and it was growing stronger. That night, I lit every candle I could find, hoping their flickering flames would hold back the oppressive darkness. The church was dimly illuminated, the golden light casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the walls. I told myself it would be enough, that the light would keep whatever was happening at bay. But when the music began again, the candles flickered as if caught in a sudden gust of wind. The melody was different this time. It wasn't slow and mournful anymore. It was frantic, discordant, each note sharp and grating, echoing through the nave with a force that made my chest ache. The organ keys moved faster, the pedals slamming against the floor as the pipes groaned under the strain. The sound filled every corner of the church, growing louder and louder until it felt like the walls were trembling. And then the choir loft came alive. The shadows returned, but they were no longer faint and flickering. They were solid now, their forms sharper, their movements more erratic. They swayed in unison, their heads tilting at unnatural angles, their arms outstretched as if conducting the invisible force driving the music. I couldn't make out their faces. There were no faces to see, just hollow voids where features should have been. But I felt their gaze, heavy and piercing, as if they were looking straight through me. The whispers rose again, weaving through the music, louder and clearer than before. They weren't words I recognized, but their intent was undeniable. It was a call, a summoning, a command that resonated deep in my chest. The journal's warning echoed in my mind. They come to finish what was begun. I stepped back, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The figures in the choir loft turned in unison, their hollow faces tilting toward me, their outstretched arms moving as if pulling me closer. The frost on the windows began to spread, creeping inward, its jagged lines branching across the glass like veins. The organ reached a crescendo, the notes crashing together in a cacophony that made my ears ring. I stumbled back into the vestry, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. The music didn't stop. It followed me, reverberating through the stone walls, shaking the very foundation of the building. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear anything beyond it, but there was nothing. No music, no whispers, no creak of the ancient wood. Just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. I sank onto the cot, my body trembling, my breath fogging in the icy air. The journal lay open on the floor where I'd dropped it earlier, its yellowed pages illuminated by the dim glow of the flashlight. My eyes fell on a passage I hadn't noticed before, its words underlined in the same frantic hand. The carol binds them. It is the lock, and it is the key. I didn't understand what it meant, but I felt its weight, its truth. The music wasn't just a haunting, it was a ritual, something designed to keep whatever was bound to the church from breaking free. But the ritual was failing. The music was changing, growing stronger, unraveling the fragile balance that had held this place together for decades. I thought about the shadows in the choir loft, their movements, their hollow gazes. They weren't just ghosts. They were part of something much larger, something that had been waiting, gathering strength. And I was caught in the middle of it. The frost on the vestry window thickened, its jagged lines forming strange, intricate patterns that looked almost like writing. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath burning in my lungs. The faintest sound reached my ears, distant and haunting. The chime of a single bell, soft and deliberate, ringing through the silence like a warning. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled toward the door, my heart pounding. The nave was dark now, the candles extinguished, the faint glow of frost, the only source of light. The organ was still, its keys untouched, but the air around it felt alive, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. The shadows in the choir loft were gone, but their presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. The frost crept along the floor, its jagged tendrils reaching toward the altar, the organ, the pews. I moved slowly, carefully, my footsteps echoing through the silent church. The chime sounded again, closer this time, its mournful tone cutting through the cold. And then, just as I reached the center of the nave, the music returned. The organ roared to life, its notes crashing together in a violent, discordant symphony. The frost surged forward, curling around my legs, my chest, pulling me toward the altar. The whispers rose again, louder and more insistent, their meaning just out of reach. The journal's warning rang in my mind. It is a calling, a summoning. I tried to move, to run, but the frost held me in place, its icy tendrils tightening around me. The shadows returned, rising from the walls, the floor, the very air itself, their hollow faces turning toward me, their arms reaching out. The music reached a deafening crescendo, the organ's pipes groaning under the strain, the whispers growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. And then everything went dark. When I came to, the church was silent. The kind of silence that makes you doubt the world outside exists anymore. The air was dense, still charged with an unshakable energy, as if it were holding its breath. My head throbbed, my hands and feet numb from the cold that clung to me like a second skin. The frost had spread across the nave, painting the walls, floor, and pews in a delicate crystalline web that glimmered faintly in the pale light filtering through the windows. The organ was silent now, its keys untouched, the pipes above it standing tall and lifeless. But the shadows were still there, lingering at the edges of my vision, shifting whenever I turned my head. I forced myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The journal's warnings echoed in my mind. It is the lock, and it is the key. I knew now that whatever had been summoned to this place wasn't gone. It was waiting. The frost beneath my boots creaked as I moved, each step an effort against the weight pressing down on my chest. The air tasted sharp, metallic, like blood. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the church itself was aware of me, observing my every move. I returned to the vestry, desperate for some kind of answer. Some way to stop whatever was happening. The journal lay open on the floor, its pages warped and brittle from the damp air. I flipped through it with trembling hands, scanning the frantic handwriting for something, anything that could help. One passage caught my eye, the words underlined with such force that the ink had bled through the page. The final carol is not a hymn. It is a threshold. To sing, it is to open the door. The meaning hit me like a punch to the gut. The music wasn't just a haunting melody, it was a ritual. Each note, each phrase was a step closer to something breaking free, something that had been locked away for a reason. And the choir, the shadows in the loft, they weren't just echoes of the past. They were part of it, guardians or servants pulling me into the ritual whether I wanted it or not. A sudden crash from the nave jolted me from my thoughts. The sound echoed through the church, reverberating through the stone walls and shaking the frost-covered floor beneath my feet. I grabbed the flashlight and stumbled back into the nave, the beam of light cutting through the dark, revealing the source of the noise. The altar had split open. The wood was cracked and splintered, jagged edges sticking out like teeth. Beneath it, a dark, yawning void stretched into the floor, the frost curling around its edges like claws. A faint, flickering light emanated from the opening, pulsing in time with the steady beat of my heart. The air around it shimmered, distorting the space, making it hard to focus. The organ came to life again, its notes low and menacing, vibrating through the nave. The frost surged forward, creeping toward the altar, drawn to the light like iron to a magnet. The shadows returned, rising from the walls, their forms darker, more defined, their hollow faces fixed on me. They didn't move this time. They stood in silence, watching, waiting, as if they were daring me to take the next step. I couldn't breathe. The cold was suffocating, the air so thick it felt like I was drowning in it. My legs moved on their own, carrying me closer to the altar, to the dark void that seemed to pulse with life. The light grew brighter as I approached, illuminating the jagged edges of the opening, casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. And then I saw it. Beneath the altar, in the heart of the void, was a figure. It was massive, its form barely visible through the flickering light, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, boring into me with an intensity that made my chest ache. The whispers returned, louder now, circling me, filling the space with a language I couldn't understand, but somehow felt. The organ's melody grew louder, more frantic, each note sharper, more dissonant, driving the frost closer to the altar, to the thing beneath it. The shadows move now, their forms twisting, merging, becoming something more, something alive. The frost climbed higher, covering the pews, the walls, the windows, until the entire nave shimmered with an icy glow. I tried to run, to turn back, but the frost held me in place, its icy tendrils curling around my legs, my arms, pulling me closer to the altar. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, blending with the organ's melody until they were one and the same. The shadows stretched toward the altar, their hollow faces tilting upward, their arms raised in a silent, reverent motion. The figure beneath the altar moved. It was subtle at first, a shift in the light, a ripple in the air, but then its form began to rise, the void beneath it growing darker, deeper, swallowing the flickering light. The frost surged forward, its jagged edges curling around the figure, wrapping it in a crystalline cocoon that pulsed and glowed with an unnatural light. The organ stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, oppressive, crushing me under its weight. The frost froze in place, the shadows stilled, the air so cold it burned. The figure beneath the altar turned, its massive form twisting toward me, its hollow face locking onto mine. And then, in a voice that was not a voice, it spoke. The words were incomprehensible, a sound that wasn't sound, but I felt their meaning, their intent. It wasn't anger or malice, it was hunger. Deep, endless, insatiable hunger. The frost surged forward one last time, consuming the altar, the organ, the walls, the very air itself, until there was nothing left but the cold and the dark and the figure beneath the altar. And then everything went still. When I woke, the church was empty. The frost was gone, the shadows vanished, the air warm and still. The altar stood whole once more, its jagged edges repaired, its surface untouched. But the organ was silent, its keys and pipes covered in dust, as if it had never played a note. But the melody was still there, faint and distant, echoing somewhere deep within my mind. The morning after, the church was unnervingly quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't just settle, it burrows. The frost had receded, leaving behind a cold dampness that clung to the air, but the sense of dread hadn't lifted. It lingered like a shadow over every corner of the nave, curling into the cracks in the stone, hanging from the wooden beams above. The altar was whole again, pristine as if it had never been touched, but I couldn't look at it without feeling the weight of what had happened beneath it. The memory of the void, the light, and the figure that moved in the dark pressed against my thoughts, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it wouldn't leave. My body felt heavier, each step an effort, the weight of the church pressing down on me like it was alive. I couldn't ignore the organ. It stood silent now, its pipes rising like monoliths against the far wall. The vibrations of the music seemed to linger in the air, faint and unrelenting, a phantom sound just out of reach. My ears strained to catch it, but the harder I listened, the less I was certain it was even there. The journal lay open on the vestry table, its pages wrinkled and yellowed, the ink bleeding into the thin paper. I found myself staring at the final passage, reading the same words over and over until they felt etched into my mind. The carol is not a hymn, it is a threshold. The organ had been the instrument, the carol the key, and now something had been unlocked. The realization sat heavy in my chest as I moved through the church, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. Every instinct told me to leave, to walk out the heavy oak doors and never come back, but I couldn't. The church wouldn't let me go, not yet. As the sun began to set, the light filtering through the stained glass windows painted the nave in fractured hues of red and gold. But the colors felt off, their warmth muted, their vibrancy smothered by the lingering cold. The shadows stretched longer than they should have, twisting and curling like smoke, reaching toward the center of the room. I froze in place as the first sound reached my ears. It wasn't the organ this time. It was a single voice, soft, and melodic, singing a slow, mournful tune. The language was unfamiliar, the words slurring together in a way that felt unnatural, but the melody was hauntingly beautiful. It filled the nave, weaving through the air like a thread, drawing me closer to the altar. The voice grew louder as I approached, joined by another, then another, until the choir loft above was alive with song. The shadows returned, darker and more defined, their hollow forms swaying in time with the music. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs heavy, the air thick with the weight of the song. The loft was filled with frost, its jagged edges creeping across the wooden railings, the figures of the choir moving in perfect unison. Their faces, or the absence of them, turned toward me, their hollow voids fixed on my approach. Music grew louder, the harmonies blending into something that was both mesmerizing and unbearable. I could see now that they weren't just shadows. Their forms had substance, their outlines shimmering faintly in the dim light, like they were caught between this world and another. The organ began to play, its deep, resonant notes blending with the voices of the choir. The frost surged forward, curling around my feet, pulling me toward the center of the loft. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath burning in my chest as the song reached a deafening crescendo. And then, everything stopped. The silence was so sudden, it was like the air had been sucked from the room. The figures in the loft stilled, their swaying forms frozen in place, their hollow faces turned toward the nave. The frost receded slightly, its jagged tendrils pausing mid-motion, as if waiting for something. I felt it before I saw it, a presence, heavy and all-encompassing, filling the space like a tidal wave. The figure from beneath the altar had risen. It stood in the center of the nave, its massive form shrouded in shadow, its edges indistinct, flickering like a flame caught in the wind. The frost clung to it, swirling around its feet, its limbs, its hollow face. It didn't move, but its presence pressed against me, suffocating, undeniable. The choir loft trembled beneath me as the organ's keys moved on their own, a single, deliberate note ringing out through the silence. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't sound. It was something deeper, something that resonated through my chest, my mind, my very being. The words weren't in a language I understood, but their meaning was clear. The carol has ended. The threshold is open. The frost surged upward, consuming the loft, the nave, the walls, and the ceiling, swallowing the church in an icy storm. The figures of the choir dissolved into the frost, their forms scattering like ash in the wind. The organ roared to life one final time, its notes chaotic and violent, shaking the very foundation of the building. The figure in the nave turned toward me, its hollow face locking onto mine, and in that moment I understood. I wasn't a witness to the ritual. I was a part of it. The carol hadn't summoned the figure. It had summoned me. The organ's music reached its final jarring note as the frost consumed everything, pulling me into the dark, into the cold, into the void. When I opened my eyes, the church was gone. I stood alone in the snow, the faint outline of the building erased from the landscape. The air was still, the frost beneath my feet shimmering faintly in the pale moonlight. But the silence wasn't empty. The melody was still there, faint and distant, echoing in the back of my mind, a song that would never truly end. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, the figure was waiting. The snow was heavier than I'd expected. It clung to the trees in thick, icy layers, muting the forest until every sound seemed to be swallowed whole. I had to drive slowly, the winding road to Whispering Pines Lodge narrowing with each passing mile. By the time the lodge came into view, I was more than ready to get out of the car, to feel the warmth of a fire, the scent of pine and cinnamon wreathing the air. It was almost perfect, almost postcard-worthy. The lodge perched at the base of a hill, its gabled roof draped with snow, golden light glowing faintly from the windows. But there was something else too, something I couldn't name. A stillness, a wrongness, in the way the building seemed to stand too straight, too untouched by the storm around it, like it had been waiting for something. Inside, the lobby was quiet, too quiet. The air was cold, despite the fire crackling in the enormous stone hearth. A towering Christmas tree stood in the corner, its ornaments catching the light in muted bursts of red and gold. It should have felt festive, welcoming, but the decorations looked too perfect, like they hadn't been touched in years. Even the faint scent of pine in the air smelled sterile, forced, like it didn't belong. There was no one at the desk, just a neatly folded note propped up by a bell that hadn't been rung in years. The handwriting was looping and old-fashioned. "Welcome to Whispering Pines Lodge. Please make yourself comfortable." That single line shouldn't have felt strange, but it did. The paper was crisp, the ink fresh, but something about it felt out of place, like it had been written for someone else. The hallway to my room stretched on longer than I remembered from the photos online. The light fixtures overhead flickered faintly, their glow uneven, and the old photographs lining the walls seemed to tilt ever so slightly, their subjects caught in mid-smile. My room was comfortable enough. Thick curtains, a massive bed draped in heavy quilts, and a view of the snow-covered forest beyond the lodge. But the silence followed me in, settling into the corners of the room like a guest that refused to leave. That night, I tried to sleep, but the stillness made it impossible. The wind howled faintly outside, rattling the window panes, but inside, everything was dead quiet. No creak of the floorboards, no groan of the building settling into the cold, no hum of the heater. It was as if the entire lodge was holding its breath. And then, around midnight, I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind, soft, lilting, carried on the edge of the storm outside. But as I strained to listen, I realized it was something else. Laughter. Faint, melodic, and coming from somewhere deep in the forest. My first instinct was to brush it off. A distant guest, perhaps, or my imagination playing tricks on me after hours of silence. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, threading its way through the thick, icy air outside my window. I pulled back the curtain, expecting to see nothing but the dark outline of the trees. But the snow below my window was marked with footprints, small scattered prints that started at the edge of the forest and led straight to the lodge. There were no prints leading back. The laughter stopped suddenly, cutting off mid-note, leaving the silence more suffocating than before. I sat back on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding in my chest, staring at the window. The frost curling along the glass caught the light from the room, creating jagged patterns that almost looked like letters, words. Words. But when I blinked, they were gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the footprints were gone, the snow outside untouched and pristine. But the memory of the laughter stayed with me, lingering at the edges of my thoughts. The lodge felt different now. The warmth I tried to find in its old wooden walls had vanished, replaced by something colder, something heavier. Even the decorations seemed more subdued, their bright colors dulled in the pale winter light. I wandered through the halls, trying to shake the unease that had settled into my chest. The photographs on the walls felt sharper now, their subjects' smiles wider, stranger, as if they'd shifted overnight. A few frames were cracked. The glass splintered across faces that were no longer quite human. I stopped in front of one that had caught my eye the night before. It was of a group standing outside the lodge, snowflakes frozen mid-fall, their breath fogging the air. I hadn't noticed before, but their eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at me. I stumbled back, the picture tilting on its hook, and hurried down the hall. The air felt colder here, sharp enough to sting my skin, and every sound I made, every footstep, every ragged breath, echoed louder than it should have. The lodge was empty. I was sure of that now. The staff, the other guests, whoever they were supposed to be, they were gone. That evening, as the light faded and the shadows grew longer, I heard the laughter again. It was louder this time, clearer, and it wasn't coming from the forest. It was inside, somewhere deep in the lodge, threading through the empty halls, its faint, lilting tone rising and falling like a song without words. I followed it, the sound pulling me forward, my legs moving before I could think to stop them. The laughter wasn't just noise anymore. It was a presence, wrapping itself around me, pressing against my ears, my chest, my mind. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, the flickering lights casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. The laughter grew louder, sharper, echoing from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My flashlight sputtered as I reached the end of the hall, the beam of light barely strong enough to pierce the darkness. And then, the laughter stopped. The silence returned, heavier than before, pressing against my ears until they rang. I turned back toward my room, my breath fogging in the icy air, and saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the light, its outline blurred, indistinct. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt its presence, its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. My chest tightened as I stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. By the time I scrambled to pick it up and turn the beam toward the figure, it was gone. The laughter didn't return that night, but the silence stayed, a constant companion that followed me wherever I went. The next morning, the lodge was eerily still, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like the world has been put on pause. The heavy silence from the night before lingered, wrapping itself around the halls, the rooms, even the air itself. My breath fogged in the cold, the temperature inside somehow colder than it had been when I'd first arrived. I tried to shake off the unease by focusing on simple tasks. There was a complimentary breakfast set up in the main dining hall, but it looked untouched. A plate of pastries sat neatly arranged on a silver tray, their surfaces dusted with powdered sugar, but there were no signs of anyone else. No voices, no footsteps, no clinking of utensils. The coffee pot was full, steam rising faintly from the spout, but the mugs on the counter were spotless, untouched. The decorations, too, felt wrong. The Christmas tree in the corner of the hall was as pristine as it had been the day before, its lights flickering faintly in a rhythm that felt deliberate. The garland draped across the mantelpiece was stiff, its evergreen branches too perfect, too uniform. I caught myself staring at one of the ornaments on the tree, its glossy surface reflecting the room in distorted curves. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the reflection, something just behind me. But when I turned, the room was empty. I stepped outside to clear my head, the snow crunching softly beneath my boots as I moved toward the edge of the forest. The trees stood tall and silent, their dark branches heavy with snow, their shadows stretching long across the ground. It was beautiful in a way, but the beauty felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of cold that cuts through your coat and settles in your bones. That's when I saw the footprints. They started at the edge of the trees, small and faint, half buried in the fresh snow. They led toward the lodge, weaving slightly as they crossed the clearing, but there was something wrong about them. They weren't deep enough to belong to a person, and the spacing between them was uneven, unnatural. My breath caught as I realized there was no sign of the prints leading back to the forest. They ended just below the window to my room. I retraced the prints back toward the lodge, my heart pounding, my breath clouding the air. The snow was pristine now, no sign of movement other than my own, but the unease remained, crawling under my skin. The lodge loomed in front of me, its windows dark, its roof heavy with snow, and for the first time since I arrived, it felt like something was watching me from within. Inside, the air was even colder than before, the chill sinking into my skin as I moved through the halls. The decorations on the tree flickered faintly, their light dim and uneven, as if the electricity was struggling to hold on. The old photographs on the walls seemed sharper now, their subjects' eyes following me as I walked past. I stopped in front of one. A family posed in front of the lodge, their faces lit with forced smiles. The more I stared, the more their eyes seemed to darken, their features blurring at the edges until their faces were almost unrecognizable. I turned away, my stomach twisting, and hurried back to my room. The hallway seemed longer than I remembered, the light overhead flickering with each step I took. My room was exactly as I'd left it, but the air inside felt heavier, the silence pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling, and sank onto the edge of the bed. That night, the laughter returned. It started softly, a faint, melodic sound that drifted through the walls like smoke. It was closer this time, louder, its lilting tone rising and falling in a rhythm that felt too deliberate to be random. I sat frozen on the bed, my heart pounding in my chest as the sound grew louder, filling the room like a song. It wasn't joyful laughter. It was slow, haunting, like the kind you'd hear in a dream you couldn't wake from. I stood, my legs trembling, and moved toward the window. The forest outside was still and dark, the snow glowing faintly under the moonlight. But the laughter wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the hallway. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to listen, and felt my breath hitch. The sound was right outside now, faint but unmistakable, threading through the silence like a needle. My hand hovered over the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me not to open it, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, pulling at me like a magnet. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The laughter stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it made my ears ring. The air felt colder, sharper, biting against my skin as I stepped into the hall. The light overhead flickered once, twice, and then steadied, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I turned back toward my room, my pulse racing, and froze. At the far end of the hall, just beyond the edge of the light, stood a figure. It was barely visible, its outline blurred, its form half hidden in the shadows. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, piercing through the darkness. My chest tightened as I stumbled back into my room, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely turn the key, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I pressed my back against the door. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, suffocating, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, watching the forest, waiting for the laughter to return. It didn't, but the unease stayed, curling around me like frost, seeping into my thoughts, my skin, my bones. The lodge wasn't just a place anymore. It was alive, and it was watching. The next day, the sense of isolation had become unbearable. The air inside the lodge was colder, heavier, carrying an unnatural stillness that pressed against my skin. Every step I took felt deliberate, echoing through the empty halls like a challenge to whatever was lurking unseen. I couldn't stop thinking about the laughter, the figure in the hall, and the way the light had seemed to bend around it. I told myself it wasn't real, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but the knots in my stomach said otherwise. I spent the morning wandering the lodge, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. The decorations seemed even more lifeless now, their cheerful colors muted as if drained of vibrancy overnight. The garlands hung limply, their once bright ribbons faded to dull shades of red and green. The Christmas tree in the lobby was still lit, but the lights flickered in erratic bursts, their pattern too deliberate to be a malfunction. The old photographs on the walls caught my attention again. The family in front of the lodge, the groups posed in their holiday best, all of them looked wrong now. Their smiles were stretched too wide, their eyes too dark, too empty. In one frame, a man stood beside a snow-covered pine, his expression frozen mid-laugh. But as I stared, his mouth seemed to twist further, his features shifting until his face became something I couldn't recognize. I turned away, my heart racing, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. The dining room was just as I'd left it, untouched. The pastries on the tray were starting to harden, their powdered sugar melting into sticky patches, But the coffee pot was still full, steam rising faintly from its spout. I hadn't seen another guest since I arrived, and yet the food and drinks remained fresh, replenished as if by unseen hands. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I quickly left the room, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. By midday, I couldn't stand the silence any longer. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a wall as I made my way toward the forest. The snow was deep, untouched, except for my own footprints, and the trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels. The stillness out here was no better than inside. If anything, it felt worse, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. The footprints were back. They started at the edge of the forest, weaving through the snow in uneven patterns, as if the person, or thing, that made them couldn't walk straight. They led toward the lodge, just like before, but this time there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, crisscrossing and overlapping, their paths converging beneath the same window as before. My window. I knelt in the snow, my breath fogging the air as I studied the prints. They were shallow, smaller than I'd expected, and the spacing between them was uneven, unnatural. Some of the impressions were too long, like the feet that made them had dragged through the snow, while others seemed to end abruptly, mid-step. My pulse quickened as I followed the trail back toward the forest, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end with every step I took. The trees grew denser as I moved deeper into the woods, their branches heavy with snow, their trunks blackened by frost. The footprints became harder to follow, their edges blurred, as if the snow itself was trying to erase them. The silence out here was absolute, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the faint whisper of the wind threading through the branches. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating, the kind of silence that made you feel like the world had stopped turning. I found the first clue at the base of a massive pine tree. A ribbon, bright red, half buried in the snow. It looked like it had been torn from a garland, its edges frayed, its color too vivid against the stark white. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the fabric stiff and cold to the touch. I turned it over in my hands, trying to make sense of its presence, but there was nothing. No other decorations, no signs of where it had come from. Just the ribbon, lying there like a piece of bait. The laughter started again. It was distant this time, soft and melodic, carried on the wind like a lullaby. But there was something sharper beneath it, a rising note of desperation that made my stomach churn. I turned toward the sound, my breath catching in my throat as I scanned the trees for movement. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, stretching long and jagged across the snow. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. Its outline was faint, blurred at the edges, but its presence was unmistakable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, boring into me from across the snow. My legs felt like lead as I tried to step back, my chest tightening with every breath. The laughter grew louder, closer, echoing through the trees in uneven bursts. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying me, its blurred form shifting like smoke caught in the wind. The ribbon slipped from my fingers, falling back into the snow as I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the frozen ground with every frantic step. The lodge came into view through the trees, its dark windows glowing faintly in the fading light. I stumbled through the snow, my lungs burning, my pulse hammering in my ears. The laughter followed me, rising and falling like a song, its melody twisting into something that felt almost human, but not quite. I slammed the door behind me, the sound reverberating through the empty halls, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The air inside was colder now, the decorations casting distorted shadows across the walls as their lights flickered erratically. My reflection stared back at me from a frosted window pane, pale and wide-eyed, but there was something else behind me. A shadow, faint and fleeting, gone the moment I turned to look. The silence returned, wrapping itself around the lodge like a shroud. I locked the door, my hands trembling, and backed away from the window, the weight of the day pressing down on me like a physical force. I didn't dare look outside again. I didn't need to. I already knew the figure was still there, waiting. The hours after I returned from the forest were a blur of cold and dread. I locked myself in my room, every sound amplified in the suffocating silence of the lodge. My breath came in shallow bursts, my heart beat a relentless drum in my ears. Outside the window, the forest loomed, its shadows stretching longer as the light began to fade. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was still out there, waiting, watching. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that the laughter, the footprints, the figure, none of it was real, but the evidence was everywhere. The ribbon I'd dropped in the forest was back. It was lying neatly folded on the desk in my room, its edges smoothed, its vibrant red almost mocking. I hadn't brought it inside. I knew that for certain. And yet there it was, as if placed there deliberately. The air in the lodge felt heavier that evening, the chill sinking deeper into my skin no matter how many layers I wore. The decorations in the hall seemed more distorted, their cheerful glow dimmed to a sickly pallor. The garlands on the walls sagged, their needles brittle and gray, as if they'd aged decades in a single day. Even the tree in the lobby had changed. Its ornaments were darker now, their reflective surfaces dull and cracked, their shapes unfamiliar. I couldn't stay in my room any longer. The walls felt like they were closing in, the silence pressing against my ears until it became unbearable. I wandered the halls, my flashlight slicing through the dim light, every creak of the floorboards beneath me making my pulse quicken. The photographs on the walls seemed to shift as I passed, their subjects' faces blurred and shadowed. In one frame, a woman stood holding a lantern, her expression serene. But as I walked by, her face seemed to turn, her eyes narrowing, her mouth twisting into something closer to a scream. The dining room was darker than before. The table where the pastries had sat was empty now, the tray gone, the surface gleaming faintly with frost. I swept a beam of my flashlight across the room, half expecting to see the figure again, but the space was empty. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like a weight pressing against my back, making every hair on my neck stand on end. It was in the library that I found the book. The room smelled of dust and old paper, the shelves lined with leather-bound volumes that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. I pulled one at random, its spine cracked, the gold lettering faded beyond recognition. The pages were brittle, the words handwritten in looping script, but it wasn't just a book. It was a ledger, a record of guests who had stayed at the lodge over the years. The entries started normally enough, listing names and dates, each entry accompanied by a brief note about the guest's stay. But as I flipped through the pages, the notes became stranger, more frantic. References to strange noises, shadows in the halls, and unexplained laughter appeared with increasing frequency. By the final entries, the handwriting was barely legible, the words scrawled across the page as if written in a panic. They come every year. The laughter is the first sign. Do not follow the footprints. The forest will take you if you let it. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling, and shoved it back onto the shelf. My pulse was racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The laughter wasn't just a haunting. It was a warning. The lodge wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding on the fear of those who stayed within its walls. The sound of a door creaking behind me made my stomach drop. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and aimed the beam toward the source of the noise. The door to the library was open, swinging gently on its hinges. The hall beyond was dark, the air colder now, sharp enough to sting my lungs with every breath. I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight cutting through the shadows, and froze. The figure was there. It stood at the far end of the hall, its outline sharper now, more defined. Its arms hung at its sides, its head tilted slightly, as if it were studying me. The light from my flashlight flickered as I aimed it toward the figure, its beam bending unnaturally around the dark shape. My chest tightened as I took a step back, the figure remaining perfectly still, its presence pressing against me like a physical force. And then it moved. It didn't walk. It glided, its form shifting like smoke, its movements too smooth, too deliberate to be human. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the light, the shadows bending and stretching in its wake. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow bursts as the figure moved closer. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor, the beams spinning wildly across the walls. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing through the halls like a twisted melody. It wasn't distant anymore. It was all around me, threading through the air, filling every corner of the lodge. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and sprinting back toward my room, the sound of the laughter chasing me with every step. The walls seemed to stretch and twist as I ran, the light flickering overhead, the air growing colder and heavier with every passing second. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands, and pressed my back against it, my chest heaving. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so thick it felt alive. I sank to the floor, my hands shaking, my breath fogging in the icy air. The lodge was suffocating now, its walls pressing inward, its shadows growing darker, deeper, more alive. I didn't dare look out the window. I already knew what I would see. The night consumed everything. The faint glow from the frost-covered windows barely lit the room, casting distorted shapes across the walls that twisted and shifted in the corner of my eye. I had pulled the blankets over myself, curling into the smallest space I could manage on the bed, the weight of the lodge pressing down on me like a vice. My heart thundered in my chest, every beat echoing louder than the last in the suffocating silence. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke, the air was different, thicker, colder. My breath fogged with each exhale, and the familiar, stifling quiet was gone. Instead, a low hum vibrated through the room, faint but insistent, like a sound just on the edge of hearing. The walls seemed to pulse faintly with the rhythm, as though the building itself were breathing. The hum grew louder as I sat up, my legs trembling beneath the blankets. I didn't want to move, didn't want to leave the perceived safety of the bed, but the hum was pulling at me, crawling into my ears and burrowing deep into my mind. It wasn't just sound. It was something alive, something calling me. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body screaming against the movement. The hum grew sharper, each vibration rattling through the room, and the air around me grew colder, so cold that it burned my lungs with every breath. The ribbon was on the floor now, lying in the exact center of the room, its crimson color stark against the frost that had crept across the wooden boards. The lights in the hallway were dim and flickering, casting the walls in uneven bursts of pale yellow. The photographs on the walls were different now. The faces of the subjects had twisted further, their once human expressions contorted into hollow screams, their mouths open wide as if caught mid-cry. I tried not to look at them as I moved past, but the sense of their eyes following me was inescapable. The hum guided me down the hall, pulling me toward the lobby like an invisible thread wrapped tight around my chest. The Christmas tree stood dark and unlit, its branches heavy with frost, its ornaments cracked and sagging. The garland that had once framed the mantel lay scattered across the floor, the ribbons frayed and torn. And then the hum stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, more oppressive than anything I'd felt before. My pulse thundered in my ears, the only sound in a void that felt so complete it was suffocating. The frost beneath my feet groaned as I moved, each step echoing in the cavernous emptiness of the lobby. The air pressed against me, thick and unyielding, as if the lodge itself were alive and watching, waiting. The figure stood by the front door. It was clearer now, its form sharp and defined, no longer just a shadow in the corner of my vision. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its face a void. a hollow emptiness that seemed to drink in the faint light, pulling it toward itself like a black hole. It didn't move, but its presence filled the room, pressing against me with a force that made it hard to breathe. The laughter returned, louder this time, filling the lobby with its twisted melody. It wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, the very air around me. The decorations on the tree shuddered, the ornaments trembling as the laughter rose to a deafening crescendo, each note jagged and piercing, cutting through the silence like glass. I stumbled backward, my legs threatening to give out, and the figure moved. It didn't walk, it glided, its motion smooth and fluid, like smoke twisting through the air. The frost surged forward, curling around its feet, its limbs, its hollow face, spreading outward like a living thing. The void where its face should have been turned toward me, and for the first time, I felt its gaze. It wasn't just looking at me. It was seeing me, peeling back every layer, exposing every thought, every fear, every weakness. The laughter grew louder, crashing against my skull, drowning out every coherent thought until all that remained was its relentless, mocking tone. The frost surged again, curling around my ankles, pulling me toward the figure. My chest tightened, every breath a struggle, the cold sinking into my skin, my bones, my mind. The figure raised a long skeletal arm, its hand stretching toward me, its hollow face tilting slightly, as if in invitation. And then, everything stopped. The laughter, the frost, the hum, gone. The air was still, the room silent, the figure frozen in place. But the weight of its gaze remained, heavy and unrelenting, pinning me to the spot. My vision blurred as the frost spread further, consuming the walls, the ceiling, the floor, until the entire lobby shimmered with an icy sheen. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, its presence suffocating. It reached for me, its hand impossibly cold as it brushed against my chest, and in that moment I understood. The lodge wasn't a place. It was a trap, a lure, feeding on those who were drawn to its empty promises of warmth and solace. The laughter wasn't joy, it was hunger, and I was its next victim. The frost surged upward, wrapping around me in a freezing cocoon, and the world dissolved into a blinding, icy light. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the hollow void of the figure's face, its emptiness consuming everything. Vei, Bua. When I woke, I was lying in the snow outside the lodge. The building was gone. In its place was an empty clearing, the snow undisturbed except for my own footprints leading to where the front door should have been. The air was cold, the forest silent, and for a moment I thought it had all been a dream. But the ribbon was in my hand, its crimson fabric frayed and stiff with frost. And somewhere, faint and distant, I could still hear the laughter. The first time I saw the mining town, it was as though I had stepped into a photograph taken long before I was born. The snow blanketed everything, softening the jagged edges of the crumbling buildings and lending an eerie, hushed beauty to the abandoned streets. It was the kind of place you might see in a history book, a snapshot of an era long gone, frozen in time. But it wasn't the beauty that struck me. It was the silence. The kind of silence that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like the world has paused, holding its breath. The air was sharp, biting against my skin as we walked toward the heart of the town. The others in the group seemed unaffected, their voices carrying faintly through the stillness, their laughter muffled by the snow. Each step I took felt heavier than the last, the weight of the place pressing down on me as though the town itself were alive, watching, waiting. I tried to shake off the unease, focusing instead on the ruins around me. The clock tower dominated the square, its silhouette jagged and dark against the pale sky. The clock face was cracked, its hands frozen at midnight, and beneath it, the faint outlines of carvings were just visible under the frost. They looked old, older than the town itself, their intricate lines and symbols seeming to shift as I stared at them. I told myself it was just the light playing tricks on my eyes, but the feeling of something ancient and wrong settled deep in my chest. We gathered near the tower, our candles flickering in the icy wind as the carols began. The songs were familiar, their melodies soft and haunting as they echoed through the empty streets. I tried to focus on the music, letting it ground me, but my gaze kept drifting to the shadows that stretched across the snow, long and distorted, shifting in ways that didn't match the movement of the light. The first few songs passed uneventfully, and for a moment I began to relax. The rhythm of the music, the warmth of the candle in my hand, the sound of our voices blending in harmony, it was almost enough to drown out the unease. But then, as we started into silent night, I heard it. At first, I thought it was just an echo, our voices bouncing off the walls of the surrounding buildings. But it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too distinct, threading through our melody with an otherworldly dissonance. It sounded human, almost, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. The voice came from somewhere deeper, beyond the square, beneath the ground. I turned toward the sound, straining to see through the dim light and falling snow, but the ruins gave nothing away. The air grew colder as the song continued, the chill sinking into my bones, making my breath fog in the air. The shadows around us seemed to shift, stretching toward the edges of the square, their movements slow and deliberate, as though drawn by the sound of our voices. My candle flickered violently, the flames sputtering as the wind picked up, and for a moment I thought it would go out entirely. The others didn't seem to notice. They sang on, their voices steady, their faces calm as though nothing had changed. I tried to match their composure, forcing myself to focus on the song, but my heart was racing, my chest tight with the weight of the unseen. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was listening, waiting just beyond the edges of the light. By the time we finished the final carol, the unease had settled into my chest like a stone. As the others began to disperse, laughing and chatting as they made their way back toward the cars, I lingered near the tower, staring at the carvings on its base. They seemed sharper now, more distinct, their lines forming shapes and symbols I couldn't understand, but felt deeply unsettled by. My breath fogged against the frozen surface as I leaned closer, my fingers brushing against the cold stone. A faint sound made me freeze. It wasn't the wind or the crunch of snow underfoot. It was something deeper, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to rise from the ground beneath me. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it carried an undeniable weight, vibrating through the stone and into my chest. I stepped back, my pulse pounding in my ears as I scanned the square for the source of the noise, but the town was empty, the others already gone. The hum grew louder as I turned toward the forest at the edge of the town, the trees dark and still against the pale snow. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a presence, something alive and ancient, pressing against the edges of my perception, pulling me toward the darkness. My legs felt heavy, my breath shallow, as though the air itself were resisting my movement. I forced myself to turn away, stumbling toward the path that led back to the cars, my candle clutched tightly in my trembling hand. The hum followed me, threading through the silence like a whisper, faint and persistent. The snow fell heavier now, the forest blurring into a wall of white as I hurried toward the faint glow of headlights in the distance. That night, the dream came. In the dream, I was back in the town square, standing beneath the clock tower. The carvings on its base glowed faintly, their shapes shifting and twisting in the pale light of the moon. The snow around me was undisturbed, pristine, but as I stared at the carvings, the ground began to crack, thin lines spider-webbing outward from my feet. The clock face above me groaned, its hands jerking violently before shattering into 1,000 shards, the sound deafening in the silence. Beneath me, the ground gave way, and I fell. The darkness swallowed me whole, cold and unyielding, and from the depths came the sound of singing. It wasn't carols this time. It was something darker, more primal, the melody jagged and discordant, each note reverberating through my chest like a heartbeat. The voices rose and fell in perfect harmony, their tone sharp and inhuman, filling the void with a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. When I woke, the sound of the singing still echoed faintly in my mind, threading through the silence of my room like a ghost. The frost on the window pane had spread, its patterns more intricate now, forming shapes that almost looked like letters. I stared at it for a long time, my breath fogging the glass, before turning away. But even as I tried to push the memory of the dream aside, the sound of the singing lingered, a faint, haunting echo that refused to leave me. The morning after the caroling, I woke to an unnatural stillness. The world outside my window was blanketed in fresh snow, pristine and undisturbed, but the air in my room felt heavy, suffocating. The frost on the glass was thicker now, its patterns more elaborate, spiraling outward like veins across the surface. I stared at it for what felt like hours, the shapes teasing at recognition before slipping away, as if they were alive, shifting just beyond the edge of comprehension. I tried to shake off the unease as I got ready for the day, but the feeling lingered, a weight pressing against my chest. Even the simplest tasks, brushing my teeth, lacing up my boots, felt deliberate, as though I were moving through water. When I stepped outside, the cold hit me like a physical force, sharp and biting, cutting through my coat and sinking into my skin. The town square was quiet when I arrived, the ruins of the mining town rising out of the snow like skeletal remains. The clock tower stood at its center, casting long shadows across the empty streets, its face cracked and frozen, the hands still stuck at midnight. The carvings on its base were more visible now. The frost that had obscured them the night before melted away. I found myself drawn to them again, their intricate lines and symbols pulling at something deep in my mind. As I moved closer, the wind picked up, whistling through the hollow buildings and carrying with it a faint, familiar sound. It wasn't the singing from the night before, but it was close, a soft, rhythmic hum, barely audible beneath the howl of the wind. It seemed to rise from the ground itself, vibrating through the snow beneath my boots, filling the air with a strange, dissonant energy. I knelt by the base of the clock tower, running my fingers over the carvings. The stone was icy to the touch, the symbols etched deep into its surface. They looked older than the town, older than the clock tower itself, their lines worn smooth by time but still precise, deliberate. My breath fogged the air as I traced their edges, the hum growing louder in my ears, pulsing in time with the frantic beating of my heart. A voice behind me made me freeze. It wasn't a word. Exactly. Just a sound. Low and guttural, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of water. I turned slowly, my pulse racing, but the square was empty. The ruins loomed dark and silent, their jagged outlines stark against the snow. The wind had stopped, the stillness so complete it felt as though the world had been drained of sound. I stood quickly, brushing the frost from my hands, and turned away from the tower. My footsteps echoed faintly as I made my way back toward the edge of the square, the weight of the carvings and the hum still pressing against my mind. The snow beneath my boots was pristine, untouched except for the faint trail I'd left behind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, watching me from the shadows. The frost on the buildings was different now, its patterns more intricate, more deliberate. They spiraled outward, like the carvings on the clock tower, their shapes sharp and angular, forming symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as I passed. I tried not to look, keeping my gaze fixed on the path ahead, but the weight of the patterns pressed against my mind, pulling at the edges of my vision. By the time I reached the forest at the edge of the town, the hum had faded, replaced by the suffocating silence of the trees. The evergreens loomed overhead, their branches heavy with snow, their dark trunks casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. I followed the narrow path back toward my car, the stillness pressing against me with every step. The footprints stopped me in my tracks. They weren't mine. They were smaller, lighter, their edges blurred, as though made by something moving too quickly to leave a clean impression. They led away from the path, weaving through the trees, their pattern erratic and uneven. My breath caught as I followed their trail with my eyes, the tracks disappearing into the deeper shadows of the forest. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of the silence pressing against my ears, the cold biting into my skin. The wind picked up again, sharp and sudden, carrying with it a faint, distant sound, a single, discordant note that echoed through the trees like a warning. My chest tightened as I turned back toward the path, my footsteps quick and uneven, the sound of my own breathing loud and ragged in the stillness. When I reached my car, the wind had stopped again, the forest behind me falling silent once more. I climbed inside, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me, the weight of the town still pressing against my chest. My breath fogged the windows as I started the engine. The faint hum of the heater, a welcome relief from the oppressive silence outside. As I drove away, the mining town disappeared into the trees, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It clung to me like the frost on the windows, cold and unrelenting, pressing against the edges of my mind. That night, I dreamed of the carvings again. They stretched across the walls of the clock tower, their lines glowing faintly in the dark, forming shapes that seemed to move and shift as I watched. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the stone beneath my feet, filling the air with a low, rhythmic pulse. The ground cracked and splintered beneath me, thin lines spreading outward like veins, and from the darkness below came the sound of voices, sharp and discordant, rising and falling in a melody that wasn't meant to be heard. I woke with a start, my chest tight, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The frost on the window was thicker now, its patterns more intricate, more alive. I stared at it for a long time, the shapes teasing at recognition, their edges sharp and angular, forming symbols that mirrored the carvings in my dream. The hum was still there, faint and distant, threading through the silence of the night like a whisper. And somewhere, in the shadows beyond the edge of the forest, something was waiting. The hum was louder the next time I returned to the mining town. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, vibrating through the snow beneath my boots, threading through the air like an unseen force. The sky was an ashen gray, the sun barely piercing the thick clouds that hung low over the forest. The ruins of the town rose before me, their jagged edges stark against the pale horizon, and the clock tower loomed at the center, its cracked face frozen at midnight. I shouldn't have gone back. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave the town and its shadows behind, but something stronger pulled me forward. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was a call, a tether wrapping itself around my chest and pulling me deeper into the ruins. Each step felt heavier than the last, the snow crunching beneath my boots the only sound in the suffocating silence. The carvings on the clock tower were clearer now, their lines sharp and precise, cutting through the frost that had once obscured them. They glowed faintly in the dim light, their shapes shifting at the edge of my vision, forming patterns that teased at recognition before slipping away. The symbols weren't random. They were deliberate, their purpose buried beneath layers of time and snow. The hum grew louder as I approached the base of the tower, vibrating through the stone, pressing against my chest like a physical weight. My breath fogged the air as I knelt to examine the carvings, my fingers brushing against the icy surface. The stone was cold, almost too cold to touch, but I couldn't pull my hand away. The lines of the carvings seemed to pulse beneath my fingers, their rhythm matching the frantic beat of my heart. That's when I saw the first footprints. They were faint, half buried in the snow, leading away from the base of the tower and toward the edge of the town. They weren't mine. They were smaller, lighter, their edges blurred as though made by something moving too quickly to leave a clean impression. My pulse quickened as I stood, my breath catching in my throat. The hum pulsed louder, sharper, threading through the silence like a warning. I followed the footprints, my legs trembling beneath me as I stepped away from the tower. The ruins loomed darker now, their jagged outlines casting long, twisted shadows across the snow. The air was colder, sharper, each breath burning in my lungs as the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, discordant melody. It wasn't singing, not exactly, but it carried the same weight, the same unnatural harmony that had haunted my dream. The footprints led me to the entrance of the mine. It yawned open at the edge of the town, a jagged maw in the earth, its edges lined with frost and shadow. The wooden beams that framed the entrance were weathered and cracked, their surfaces etched with the same carvings as the clock tower. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the ground, filling the air with its low, rhythmic pulse. My legs felt like lead as I stepped closer, the weight of the mine's presence pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The footprints disappeared into the darkness of the tunnel. I hesitated at the entrance, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I stared into the blackness beyond. The air that seeped from the mine was freezing, sharp and metallic, carrying with it a faint, sour smell that turned my stomach. The hum pulsed louder, sharper, threading through my thoughts, pulling me forward with an invisible force. I stepped inside. The darkness swallowed me whole, the weak beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the shadows. The walls of the tunnel were lined with frost, their surfaces slick and uneven, the carvings etched deep into the stone. The hum vibrated through the air, louder now, sharper, each pulse rattling through my chest like a second heartbeat. The further I went, the more the tunnel changed. The walls grew narrower, their surfaces jagged and sharp, the frost forming intricate patterns that mirrored the carvings. The air grew colder, the metallic tang stronger, burning my lungs with every breath. And the melody, the faint, discordant sound that had followed me from the surface, was louder now, threading through the hum, blending with it in a twisted harmony that made my skin crawl. I found the first relic deep within the tunnel. It was a lantern, its metal frame rusted and bent, its glass cracked and blackened. It hung from a wooden beam, its presence strange and out of place, as though it had been left there deliberately. My flashlight flickered as I approached, the beam sputtering as though the air itself were resisting the light. The carvings on the walls pulsed faintly, their lines glowing with a dim, unnatural light. The hum grew louder as I reached for the lantern, the sound vibrating through the air, pressing against my ears like a scream. My hand trembled as I touched the metal, the surface icy and rough beneath my fingers. The melody twisted, sharp and jagged, rising in pitch as the hum pulsed faster, more insistent, threading through my thoughts like a needle. And then everything went still. The hum stopped, the air falling silent, the weight of the mine pressing against me with an unbearable force. The darkness seemed to close in, the shadows twisting and shifting at the edges of my vision. I turned, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and saw the first figure. It stood at the edge of the tunnel, its outline faint and blurred, its presence heavy and suffocating. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its gaze, sharp and unrelenting, boring into me from the shadows. My chest tightened, my breath catching in my throat as I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam shaking wildly across the walls. The hum returned, louder now, sharper, threading through the air like a scream. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, its blurred outline twisting like smoke. The carvings on the walls pulsed with a blinding light, their shapes shifting and twisting, forming patterns that burned into my mind. The last thing I saw before the flashlight went out was the figure's face, or the absence of it. A hollow void, dark and endless, pulling at the edges of my vision, drawing me into the shadows. And then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, the darkness hadn't lifted. The beam of my flashlight was gone, swallowed whole by the black, leaving me alone in a void, so complete it felt suffocating. The air was frigid, sharp, each breath burning my lungs. My hands fumbled over the frozen ground, the frost biting into my skin as I searched blindly for the flashlight. My pulse hammered in my ears, each beat echoing through the silence like a desperate drum. And then, faintly, the hum returned. It wasn't loud, not at first, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. It vibrated through the stone walls around me, low and deliberate, rising and falling like a heartbeat. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing, the weight of the sound pressing against my chest. It wasn't just a noise. It was a presence, filling the space around me, threading through the air like something alive. I scrambled to my feet, my hand brushing against the cold metal of the lantern I had found earlier. It felt heavier now, its frame sharp and jagged beneath my fingers. The glass was cracked, but when I fumbled with the small knob on its side, a faint flicker of light sparked to life, casting jagged shadows across the walls of the tunnel. The carvings were glowing now. Their lines pulsed faintly, their sharp, angular shapes shifting in the flickering light of the lantern. They twisted and writhed across the walls, forming patterns that felt deliberate, intentional, but just out of reach of understanding. The hum grew louder as I stared, vibrating through my chest, pulling at the edges of my mind. The walls seemed to close in, the space around me tightening, pressing against my skin like a living thing. I took a step back, the lantern trembling in my hand, and that's when I saw the first shadow move. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was deliberate, purposeful, its form shifting along the wall, dark and fluid, its edges flickering like smoke. My breath caught as I turned, the lantern shaking, its dim light casting sharp, jagged lines across the tunnel. The shadow wasn't alone. There were more of them now, twisting and merging, their shapes rising from the walls, from the floor, from the very air around me. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, the vibrations rattling through my skull, my chest, my thoughts. The shadows moved closer, their forms sharper now, more defined, their edges cutting through the air like blades. I stumbled backward, my legs trembling beneath me, my breath fogging in the icy air. The light from the lantern flickered violently, its flame struggling against the weight of the darkness. And then, the singing began. It was faint at first, threading through the hum like a needle, its melody sharp and discordant. The voices weren't human. They were too sharp, too jagged, rising and falling in unnatural harmonies that made my skin crawl. They echoed through the tunnel, weaving through the air like a web, each note pulling me deeper into the void. The shadows parted, and I saw the source of the sound. At the far end of the tunnel, the ground gave way to a massive cavern, its edges lined with jagged rocks and frost-covered walls. The carvings here were brighter, their lines glowing with a cold, pale light that pulsed in time with the melody. In the center of the cavern stood a figure, tall and dark, its outline sharp and angular, its limbs too long, too thin, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face was a hollow void, dark and endless, pulling at the edges of the light, drawing it into itself. The voices rose around it, sharp and piercing, their melody twisting into a crescendo that reverberated through the cavern like a scream. The air was heavy, suffocating, each breath a struggle as I stumbled forward, the lantern flickering in my trembling hand. The figure turned toward me, its hollow face tilting, its limbs twisting in slow, deliberate movements. The hum grew louder, sharper, threading through the air like a knife, cutting into my thoughts, my skin, my chest. The carvings on the walls pulsed brighter, their lines shifting, twisting into shapes that burned into my mind, their patterns sharp and deliberate. The singing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, more oppressive than the hum had ever been. The air was so still, it felt like the world had stopped turning, the weight of the cavern pressing against me with an unbearable force. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate, each step vibrating through the ground like a drumbeat. The void of its face was all I could see, a darkness so complete it threatened to consume me. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound. It was a vibration, a resonance that filled the air, the ground, the very marrow of my bones. It wasn't a language I understood, but the meaning pressed into me, searing into my mind with an unrelenting force. You called to me. You opened the door. The ground beneath me cracked, the frost splitting into jagged lines that spread outward, crawling toward the figure. The air grew colder, the metallic tang sharp and acrid, burning my lungs with every breath. The carvings on the walls pulsed violently, their light blinding, their patterns shifting into shapes that felt like words, commands, warnings. The figure reached for me, its limbs impossibly long, its presence suffocating. The hum returned, louder now, vibrating through the cavern, threading through my chest, my mind, my thoughts. The light from the lantern flickered one final time, its flame guttering, and as the darkness swallowed me, the last thing I saw was the hollow void of the figure's face, pulling me into the endless black. I awoke on the cold, uneven floor of the cavern. My head throbbed, my chest ached, and every breath burned with the metallic tang of the air. The lantern lay beside me, its glass cracked but faintly glowing, its light barely piercing the suffocating darkness. For a moment, I thought I was alone. The silence pressed against me, heavy and relentless, but it wasn't empty. It was watching, waiting. The hum returned, faint and rhythmic, pulsing through the ground beneath me. It felt like a heartbeat, deep and steady, thrumming in time with the ache in my skull. I sat up slowly, the world spinning around me as my eyes adjusted to the dim light. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, their sharp angular shapes twisting and shifting like living things, their patterns forming and dissolving in endless cycles. I wasn't alone. The figure stood at the far end of the cavern, its outline sharper now, its edges jagged and wrong. Its limbs were impossibly long, its movements slow and deliberate, each step sending ripples through the air like waves. Its face, or the absence of it, was a hollow void, dark and endless, pulling at the edges of the light, drinking it in until the cavern seemed darker with each passing moment. The hum grew louder as the figure moved closer, threading through the air like a living thing, vibrating through the stone and into my chest. My pulse quickened, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I stumbled to my feet, the lantern trembling in my hand. The carvings on the walls pulsed in time with the hum, their lines glowing brighter, their shapes shifting into patterns that felt deliberate, purposeful. The figure stopped, its head tilting slightly, its hollow face fixed on me. The hum changed, rising and falling in sharp, discordant waves, its rhythm fracturing into a melody that made my skin crawl. The carvings on the walls shifted violently, their lines forming shapes that burned into my mind, their patterns sharp and unnatural. And then, it spoke. The voice wasn't a sound, it was a presence, a resonance that filled the cavern, the ground, the air, and the very marrow of my bones. It was a language I couldn't understand, but its meaning pressed into me, searing into my mind like a brand. The words twisted and burned, their weight suffocating, each one vibrating through my skull until it felt like my thoughts were shattering under their force. The door is open. The threshold is crossed. The ground beneath me cracked, thin lines spiderwebbing outward, the frost splitting into jagged shards that glimmered faintly in the dim light. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath a struggle as the cavern seemed to shrink around me, the darkness pressing closer, heavier, suffocating. The carvings on the walls pulsed violently, their light flickering in sharp staccato bursts, their patterns dissolving into chaos. The figure stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate, each step shaking the ground beneath my feet. My chest tightened as I stumbled backward, the lantern shaking in my hand, its light flickering weakly. The void of the figure's face seemed to expand, pulling at the edges of the light, swallowing it whole, leaving nothing but darkness in its wake. I turned and ran. The tunnel seemed endless, its walls closing in, the carvings glowing faintly as the hum followed me, louder and sharper with every step. The air burned in my lungs, the frost beneath my boots cracking and splintering as I ran, my footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. The hum grew louder, threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very being, until it felt like it would tear me apart. The lantern sputtered and died, its light extinguished, leaving me in complete darkness. I stumbled, my hands scraping against the jagged walls, the sharp edges of the carvings cutting into my skin. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the tunnel, through me, until it felt like the entire world was shaking beneath its weight. And then, the singing began. The voices were sharp and discordant, rising and falling in a twisted melody that made my skin crawl. They echoed through the tunnel, threading through the hum, blending with it in a cacophony that felt alive, sentient. The air grew heavier, colder, the metallic tang so strong it burned my throat, my chest, my thoughts. The shadows moved around me, twisting and shifting, their forms sharp and jagged, their edges flickering like flames. They rose from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself, merging and splitting, their movements deliberate, purposeful. The singing grew louder, its melody sharper, each note cutting through the air like a blade, threading through my mind like a needle. The ground beneath me gave way. I fell into the void, the darkness swallowing me whole, the voices rising in a deafening crescendo, their melody twisting into something sharp and unnatural, something that wasn't meant to exist. The carvings pulsed around me, their lines glowing brighter, their patterns shifting into shapes that burned into my mind, their purpose searing into my thoughts. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the void of the figure's face, its hollow emptiness pulling at the edges of my vision, drawing me into the endless black. When I awoke, the cavern was gone. I was lying in the snow outside the mining town, the ruins silent and still, their jagged outlines stark against the pale sky. The frost on the ground beneath me was untouched, pristine, as though nothing had disturbed it. The lantern lay beside me, its frame cold and rusted, its glass shattered, its light extinguished. The hum was gone, but its weight lingered, pressing against my chest, threading through my thoughts like an echo. The carvings on the walls of the ruins were faint now, their lines faded, their glow extinguished. But the feeling of being watched remained, heavy and unrelenting, wrapping around me like a shroud. As I stumbled back toward the forest, the town disappeared behind me, swallowed by the snow and the shadows. The silence was oppressive, suffocating, but it wasn't empty. It was alive, threading through the air, the ground, the very fabric of the world around me. And somewhere, faint and distant, I could still hear the singing. The snow fell in relentless waves as I made my way toward the inn, each flake heavy and wet, clinging to the windshield and blurring the narrow road ahead. The wipers groaned in protest, smearing more than clearing the view, but it didn't matter. The forest loomed on either side, dense and dark, the towering pines bending under the weight of winter. The directions I'd been given were useless now. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and all that remained was a narrow ribbon of road cutting through the wilderness. The inn wasn't marked on any maps, and the locals had been vague when I'd asked about it. They'd nodded knowingly, their eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite place. Reluctance, maybe, or even fear. The 12 Nights Festival is tradition, one woman had said before quickly turning away, her hands tightening around her shopping bag. It's better not to ask too many questions. When the inn finally appeared, it seemed to rise out of the snow, its dark silhouette stark against the pale expanse of white. The building was old, much older than I'd expected. Its peaked roof was heavy with snow, icicles hanging like teeth from the eaves. The windows glowed faintly with warm, golden light, but the effect wasn't comforting. It was unsettling. The light flickered slightly, as though struggling to hold back the darkness pressing in from the forest. I parked in the gravel lot, the tires crunching against the frozen ground, and stepped out into the biting wind. The air smelled sharp and metallic, the cold sinking into my skin and stealing my breath. The trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with snow, their shadows long and jagged under the weak light of the inn's lanterns. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the stillness like a warning. Inside, the air was warmer, but no less heavy. The smell of pine and wax filled the space, undercut by something faintly sour, like damp wood left too long to rot. The lobby was dimly lit, the fire in the stone hearth flickering weakly, casting long flickering shadows across the wooden walls. The decorations struck me first. They were elaborate, almost overdone. Garlands of evergreen draped across the beams, candles burning with faintly colored flames, and an enormous Christmas tree dominating the far corner of the room. But it wasn't the kind of cheer you'd expect. The ornaments were strange, carved from wood and bone, their shapes twisting into patterns that made my eyes ache if I stared too long. The tree's needles were dry and brittle, their green faded to an almost grayish hue, and the star at the top was tarnished, its edges jagged and uneven. The innkeeper appeared without a sound, her presence startling in the oppressive quiet. She was an older woman, her face lined with deep wrinkles, her expression guarded. Her eyes were sharp, her gaze heavy, as though she were weighing every detail about me. "Welcome to the 12 Nights Festival," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "We're glad you could join us." Her words felt rehearsed, as though she'd spoken them 1,000 times before, and the way she lingered on the word festival sent a chill crawling up my spine. She handed me a small envelope sealed with red wax. "Read this carefully," she said, her voice tinged with something I couldn't place. Warning, maybe, or regret. "It's important." The envelope contained a list of rules, written in neat, spidery handwriting. 1. Attend the nightly gatherings without exception. 2. Accept any gift given to you and place it under the tree. 3. Do not remove or disturb the decorations. 4. Stay in your room after midnight. My stomach tightened as I read the last rule, the weight of it pressing down on me like a stone. When I looked up, the innkeeper was gone, leaving only the faint echo of her footsteps fading into the dim hallway. The first night began with a feast in the grand dining room. The other guests, 12 of us in total, sat at the long candlelit table, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were a quiet, solemn group, their laughter forced, their smiles tight. The food was rich and heavy, the kind that makes you feel sluggish after just a few bites. I picked at my plate, the unease in my chest growing with each passing moment. After dinner, we gathered around the Christmas tree in the parlor. Its ornaments glinted dully in the firelight, their strange shapes casting distorted shadows on the walls. Beneath the tree were 12 boxes, each wrapped in dark green paper and tied with a blood-red ribbon. The innkeeper handed one to each of us, her hands trembling slightly as she placed mine in my lap. Inside was a single object, a small tarnished bell. It was cold to the touch, heavier than it looked, and as I held it, I thought I heard it hum faintly, a low vibration that seemed to echo in my chest. The others had received similar gifts, a cracked mirror, a broken watch, a withered wreath, but no one spoke. We placed the gifts under the tree, as instructed, and the night ended without ceremony. Back in my room, the air felt heavier, the stillness pressing against me like a physical weight. The bed was large, its canopy draped in heavy red velvet that blocked out the faint light from the hallway. The windows were frosted over, the intricate patterns etched into the glass, looking almost deliberate. I reached out to wipe them away but stopped, a deep instinctual warning tightening in my chest. The inn was silent after midnight. Not peaceful, but oppressive. The kind of silence that isn't an absence of sound, but a presence in its own right. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the rules pressing against my thoughts. Stay in your room after midnight. The words echoed in my mind, heavy with meaning I didn't understand. I thought I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, but when I listened closer, they were gone. The dreams came that night, vivid and suffocating. I was back in the parlor, standing before the Christmas tree. Its ornaments glowed faintly, their light pulsing in time with a deep, rhythmic hum that seemed to rise from the floor. The gifts beneath the tree shifted and twisted, their shapes stretching and writhing like living things. And then I saw it, a shadow, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its face hidden beneath a veil of shifting darkness. It stood behind the tree, its hollow gaze fixed on me, its presence suffocating. The hum grew louder, sharper, threading through the air like a needle, and the shadow stepped closer, its form twisting like smoke. I woke with a start, my chest tight, my breath fogging the icy air. The frost on the windows had spread, its patterns sharper now, more intricate, almost alive. For a moment, I thought I heard the faint echo of a bell ringing in the distance, its sound threading through the silence like a whisper. And somewhere in the inn, far below the surface, the hum continued. The next morning, the air inside the inn felt different, thicker, heavier, as though something unseen had settled into the walls during the night. The frost on the windows hadn't melted, despite the faint warmth of the rising sun. Instead, it had spread, the intricate patterns growing sharper and more deliberate, their shapes twisting into symbols that made my stomach churn if I looked too long. I hadn't slept well. The dream still lingered at the edges of my mind, its details blurry yet suffocating in their weight. The shadow, the hum, the distorted tree, they all pressed against my thoughts, leaving a heaviness in my chest I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just a dream, just my imagination reacting to the strange setting, but deep down, I didn't believe. The other guests were subdued at breakfast. No one mentioned the gifts from the night before, nor the rules tucked away in each of our rooms. The conversations were shallow and perfunctory, as though everyone were tiptoeing around something they couldn't name. I noticed their eyes, though, how they darted toward the frost-covered windows, how they lingered on the dark hallways leading deeper into the inn. They felt it too, whatever it was. The innkeeper appeared again, her presence as unsettling as ever. She didn't speak this time, just stood at the edge of the dining room, her sharp eyes sweeping over the group like she was counting us, making sure none of us were missing. Her gaze lingered on me for a moment, her expression unreadable, before she turned and disappeared down the hall. The day passed in a strange haze. The inn was eerily quiet, the only sounds the faint creak of the old wood and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. The decorations seemed more oppressive in the daylight, the garlands drooping under their own weight, the antique ornaments glinting dully in the weak sunlight. The Christmas tree in the parlor was the worst. Its dry needles looked almost gray now, its twisted ornaments catching the light in ways that made them seem alive. The gifts beneath it remained untouched, their dark green paper gleaming faintly as though hiding something terrible beneath. The second night began like the first, a feast in the grand dining room. The air was heavy with the smell of roasted meat and spiced wine, but the food sat like lead in my stomach. The other guests were quieter now, their voices subdued, their laughter forced. I caught glimpses of their hands shaking as they raised their glasses, their eyes darting toward the shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. After dinner, we gathered again around the tree. This time, the atmosphere was different. The air felt colder, sharper, each breath biting against my throat. The fire in the hearth burned low, its flames flickering weakly, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The ornaments on the tree seemed to pulse faintly, their shapes twisting in ways that made my chest tighten. The innkeeper handed out the second set of gifts. Mine was a small, cracked mirror, its surface clouded and warped. As I held it, I thought I saw something move within its reflection, a flicker of motion that wasn't my own. I turned it over quickly, my hands trembling, and placed it beneath the tree with the others. The hum returned as I stepped back, faint and rhythmic, threading through the silence like a heartbeat. The night ended without ceremony, the guests retreating to their rooms in uneasy silence. Back in my own room, the air was colder than before, the frost on the windows thicker, its patterns spreading across the glass like veins. I couldn't stop myself from staring at them, the symbols teasing at recognition, their sharp edges twisting into shapes that felt alive. The hum was louder here, vibrating faintly through the floorboards, pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the rules pressing against my mind. Stay in your room after midnight. The words echoed in my head, their meaning heavy and deliberate. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows, but beneath it, I thought I heard something else, a faint, melodic sound threading through the night like a whisper. The dreams came again. This time, I was standing in a hallway I didn't recognize, the walls lined with frost, the air sharp and metallic. The carvings from the windows were etched into the wood, their lines glowing faintly in the dim light. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the walls, filling the air with its low, rhythmic pulse. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, my steps slow and uneven, the ground beneath me shifting like sand. At the end of the hallway was a door. It was tall and narrow, its surface covered in the same carvings, their shapes pulsing faintly in time with the hum. As I approached, the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in pale, flickering light. Inside was the Christmas tree, its ornaments glowing faintly, their shapes twisting and shifting like living things. The gifts beneath it writhed, their dark green paper splitting open to reveal shadows that twisted and stretched, their edges sharp and jagged. And then I saw the shadow again. It stood behind the tree, its limbs too long, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face, or the absence of it, was a hollow void, dark and endless, pulling at the edges of the light, drinking it in until the room seemed darker with each passing moment. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, the vibrations rattling through my chest, my mind, my very being. The shadow stepped closer, its form twisting like smoke, its presence suffocating. I woke with a start, my chest tight, my breath fogging the icy air. The room was silent, but the hum lingered, faint and persistent, threading through the stillness like a warning. The frost on the windows had spread further, the patterns sharper now, their shapes pressing against the glass as though trying to break through. And somewhere in the distance, faint and haunting, I thought I heard the sound of bells ringing. The third day dawned in a haze of gray light and unrelenting cold. The frost on the windows of my room was so thick it blocked out most of the pale, wintry sun. I stared at the intricate patterns etched across the glass, their jagged lines twisting into something that felt deliberate, almost sentient. They pulsed faintly in the light, as though alive, and I couldn't bring myself to touch them. Downstairs, the atmosphere was different. The other guests, already seated for breakfast, wore the weight of sleepless nights in their pale faces and shadowed eyes. No one spoke as they picked at the food laid out before them. Even the clinking of utensils felt intrusive, breaking the suffocating silence that hung heavy in the air. The decorations in the dining room had shifted subtly. The garlands drooped lower, their needles dry and brittle, and the antique ornaments reflected the dim light in ways that seemed unnatural. The fire in the hearth burned low, its flames weak and flickering, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I felt those shadows more than saw them, their presence heavy and oppressive, stretching toward us like fingers. It wasn't just the shadows, though. There was something else, a hum, faint but insistent, threading through the silence, vibrating just beneath the surface of hearing. By mid-morning, I couldn't bear the stifling atmosphere any longer. I needed air, needed to escape the confines of the inn, even if only for a little while. Pulling on my coat and boots, I stepped outside into the biting cold. The forest surrounding the inn was still and silent, its trees standing tall and heavy with snow. The sky above was a flat, unbroken expanse of gray, and the air smelled sharp and metallic, burning in my lungs with every breath. The Christmas tree in the yard stood taller than it had before, or maybe I was imagining it. Its twisted branches were laden with ornaments that gleamed faintly in the gray light, their shapes jagged and unnatural. The red ribbon wound around the tree's trunk had faded further, its edges frayed and brittle. I looked away quickly, the sight of it sending a chill crawling up my spine. I wandered toward the edge of the property, where the forest loomed darker, its shadows deeper. The snow here was untouched, pristine, but something about it felt wrong. The air grew colder as I stepped closer, the silence pressing against my ears like a physical weight. My breath fogged in the air, and the faint hum I'd heard earlier grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath my boots, threading through the stillness like a warning. That's when I noticed the footprints. They started just beyond the tree line, faint and shallow, their edges blurred as though made by something moving too quickly to leave a clean impression. They weren't mine. They weren't anyone's. The thought struck me like a punch to the chest, my breath catching in my throat as I followed their erratic path through the snow. They led toward the forest, weaving between the trees, their pattern uneven and unnatural. I stopped at the edge of the forest, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, the hum vibrating through my chest. The trees loomed overhead, their branches heavy with snow, their shadows stretching long and jagged across the ground. The footprints disappeared into the deeper shadows, their edges dissolving into the frost-covered ground. I wanted to follow, to know where they led, but every instinct screamed at me to turn back. Back at the inn, the other guests were gathered in the parlor, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. The Christmas tree dominated the room, its ornaments casting distorted reflections across the walls. The gifts beneath it had shifted, small movements that couldn't have been natural. The green paper covering them was torn in places, revealing glimpses of dark, twisted shapes within. That night, the third gift appeared. It was smaller than the others, a simple, tarnished key that felt heavier than it should. I held it in my hand, its cold surface biting into my skin, the faint hum growing louder as I stared at it. The other guests received their own keys, their expressions unreadable as they placed them beneath the tree alongside the other offerings. The tree pulsed faintly in the dim light, its ornaments shifting and twisting as though alive. The hum was louder now, threading through the air, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very fabric of the inn itself. The fire in the hearth burned low, its flames casting jagged shadows that stretched across the room, their edges flickering like living things. Back in my room, the air was colder than ever. The frost on the windows had spread further, its patterns sharper, more intricate, forming shapes that pressed against the glass like something trying to break through. The hum was constant now, a low, rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the floorboards, threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very being. The dreams came again, vivid and suffocating. I was back in the parlor, standing before the tree. Its ornaments glowed faintly, their shapes twisting into patterns that burned into my mind. The gifts beneath the tree writhed, their green paper splitting open to reveal shadows that twisted and stretched, their edges sharp and jagged. The air was sharp and metallic, burning in my lungs, and the hum was deafening, vibrating through the room like a scream. The shadow stood behind the tree, its limbs too long, its movements slow and deliberate. Its hollow face tilted toward me, its presence suffocating, pulling at the edges of my mind. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo, its vibrations rattling through my skull, threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very being. I woke with a start, the weight of the dream pressing against me like a physical force. The frost on the windows had spread further, its patterns sharper, more alive. The hum was louder now, threading through the air, the walls, the very fabric of the room. Somewhere in the distance, faint and haunting, I thought I heard the sound of bells ringing. The fourth night brought with it a darkness that felt alive. The air inside the inn was colder than ever, biting at my skin no matter how many layers I wore. The frost on the windows had spread across the walls, its sharp patterns curling and twisting into something deliberate, something malevolent. The hum that had haunted the edges of my thoughts was louder now, a steady pulse that vibrated through the floors, the walls, the very foundation of the building. The other guests were quieter than ever. At dinner, their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, their movements slow and mechanical. They avoided looking at one another, their gazes fixed on their plates or on the flickering shadows that stretched across the dining room. The fire burned low in the hearth, its flames struggling against the oppressive cold, and the garlands that decorated the walls were brittle, their needles gray and withered. When the meal was over, we gathered once more in the parlor. The Christmas tree stood taller now, its twisted branches reaching toward the ceiling, its ornaments gleaming faintly in the dim light. The gifts beneath it had grown darker, their paper torn and frayed, revealing glimpses of the shadows within. The hum was deafening here, threading through the air, vibrating through the floor, pressing against my chest with an almost physical force. The fourth gift was placed into my hands, a small, broken clock. Its face was cracked, its hands frozen at midnight, its surface cold and rough against my skin. I held it for a moment, the hum growing louder, sharper, threading through my thoughts, before placing it beneath the tree. The other guests received their gifts in silence, their faces blank, their hands trembling as they added their offerings to the growing pile. The tree pulsed faintly as the last gift was placed beneath it. The ornaments twisted and writhed, their sharp edges catching the light, their reflections flickering across the walls like ghosts. The fire in the hearth sputtered, the shadows stretching and shifting, their edges jagged and unnatural. Back in my room, the air was suffocating, heavy with the weight of the frost that now covered the walls and ceiling. The patterns were sharper than ever, their shapes more intricate, forming symbols that burned into my mind if I stared too long. The hum was relentless now, a low, rhythmic pulse that threaded through my chest, my thoughts, my very being. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the hum grew louder, the frost pressing closer, the weight of the inn bearing down on me like a living thing. The silence outside my door was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards, as though someone, or something, was pacing the hall. I stayed in bed, my chest tight, my breath shallow, the words of the rules echoing in my mind. Stay in your room after midnight. The dreams, when they came, were worse than before. I was back in the parlor, standing before the Christmas tree. Its ornaments glowed faintly, their shapes twisting and shifting, their sharp edges casting jagged shadows across the walls. The gifts beneath the tree had split open, their contents spilling out in a writhing mass of darkness that moved and stretched like living things. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through the air, rattling through my chest, my skull, my very thoughts. The room was cold, the air sharp and metallic, each breath burning in my lungs. The tree twisted and writhed, its branches reaching toward me, its ornaments glowing brighter, their light pulsing in time with the hum. And then I saw the shadow. It stood behind the tree, its limbs impossibly long, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face, or the absence of it, was a hollow void, dark and endless, pulling at the edges of the light, swallowing it whole. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo, the vibrations tearing through the room, the shadows twisting and stretching, their jagged edges cutting into the air. The shadow stepped closer, its presence suffocating, its form twisting like smoke. Its limbs stretched toward me, their edges sharp and jagged, their movements deliberate. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, the ground beneath me shifting and cracking, the frost spreading outward like veins. The carvings on the walls of the parlor glowed brighter now, their lines sharp and angular, their patterns shifting and twisting, forming symbols that burned into my mind. The hum vibrated through them, threading through the air, the ground, my chest, my very being. I woke with a start, my chest tight, my breath fogging the icy air of my room. The frost on the windows had spread across the floor, now its patterns sharper, more alive. The hum was louder than ever, vibrating through the walls, the floor, the very fabric of the inn. The silence outside my door was heavy, oppressive, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. Somewhere in the distance, faint and haunting, I thought I heard the sound of bells ringing. And beneath it, threading through the silence like a whisper, was the hum. The final night descended with a heaviness I could feel in my bones. The inn seemed darker than before, its walls pressing in, the air inside sharp and metallic. The frost that had spread across my room was no longer confined to the windows. It crawled across the floor and up the walls, its intricate patterns forming symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The hum was omnipresent now, threading through the air, vibrating through the floor, resonating in my chest. I didn't want to leave my room, but the rules demanded it. Skipping the final gathering wasn't an option. The list had made that clear. Attend the nightly gatherings without exception. My hands trembled as I pulled on my coat, the fabric stiff from the cold that had seeped into every corner of the inn. The air smelled sharper now, metallic and sour, like blood on iron. The hallways were empty as I stepped out of my room, the silence suffocating. The frost covered everything, the walls shimmering faintly with their sharp, angular patterns. My breath fogged in the cold air, each exhale a ghostly plume that hung heavy around me. The hum grew louder as I approached the stairs, vibrating through the wood, making it groan beneath my weight. When I entered the parlor, the sight before me froze me in place. The Christmas tree had transformed. It was taller now, its twisted branches stretching toward the ceiling, its dry needles brittle and gray. The ornaments that hung from its boughs pulsed faintly, their shapes sharper, more jagged, their surfaces reflecting the dim light in ways that made my head ache. The gifts beneath the tree had split open, their dark green paper shredded, revealing contents that twisted and writhed, their edges sharp and jagged. The other guests were already there, their faces pale, their eyes hollow. They stood in a circle around the tree, their movements slow and deliberate, their expressions blank. The hum was deafening here, threading through the room like a living thing, vibrating through the floor, the walls, the air. My chest tightened as I stepped forward, my legs trembling, my breath shallow. The innkeeper appeared, her face sharper, her eyes darker, her presence heavier. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she gestured for us to approach the tree. The air grew colder as I stepped closer, each breath burning in my lungs, the hum rattling through my skull, my thoughts, my very being. The final gift was waiting for me. It was small, wrapped in black paper with a blood ribbon. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the cold seeping through the paper, biting into my skin. The hum grew louder, sharper, vibrating through my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. I tore the paper away with shaking hands, revealing the contents within. A single shard of glass, its edges jagged, its surface reflecting something that wasn't me. The other guests opened their gifts in silence, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. The objects they revealed were just as strange. A withered hand, a cracked bone, a small rusted knife, but none of them spoke. They moved in unison, placing their offerings beneath the tree, their steps slow, deliberate, as though guided by something unseen. When the last gift was placed beneath the tree, the hum rose to a deafening crescendo. The ornaments on the tree pulsed violently, their shapes twisting and writhing, their sharp edges catching the light in jagged, unnatural patterns. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, their edges flickering like flames, their movements sharp and deliberate. The tree began to move. Its branches stretched and twisted, their edges sharp, their shapes unnatural. The ornaments detached themselves, floating upward, their sharp edges spinning, reflecting the flickering light in ways that made my head ache. The gifts beneath the tree writhed and twisted, their contents spilling out, merging into a mass of shadow that grew larger, darker, heavier. And then it appeared. The shadow rose from the tree, its form sharp and angular, its limbs impossibly long, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face, or the absence of it, was a hollow void, dark and endless, pulling at the edges of the light, swallowing it whole. The hum became a roar, vibrating through the room, through my chest, through my very being. As the shadow stepped forward, its presence suffocating. The other guests stood still, their eyes blank, their faces expressionless, as though entranced. The shadow moved among them, its hollow gaze passing over each of them, its limbs twisting and stretching, its movements slow and deliberate. My chest tightened as it turned toward me, its hollow face tilting, its presence pressing against me like a physical weight. The carvings on the walls pulsed violently, their lines glowing brighter, their shapes twisting and shifting into patterns that burned into my mind. The air grew colder, sharper, each breath a struggle as the shadow stepped closer, its void-like face pulling at the edges of my vision. It stopped before me, its presence suffocating, its limbs stretching toward me. The hum grew louder, sharper, threading through my thoughts, my chest, my very soul. The carvings on the walls pulsed one final time, their lines twisting into a single sharp pattern that burned into my mind, their meaning searing into my thoughts. The gift is chosen. The shadow's voice wasn't a sound. It was a vibration, a resonance that filled the air, the ground, the very marrow of my bones. The carvings glowed brighter, their lines twisting into shapes that burned into my mind, their meaning sharp and deliberate. The ground beneath me cracked, the frost spreading outward, its jagged lines splitting the floor, the air sharp and metallic, burning in my lungs. The shadow stepped closer, its limbs twisting, its hollow face consuming everything. The hum became a roar, the carvings glowing brighter, their lines sharper, their shapes twisting into patterns that seared into my thoughts. And then everything went dark. When I woke, the inn was gone. The forest was silent, the snow untouched, the sky pale and empty. The place where the inn had stood was nothing but a hollow in the earth, its edges lined with frost, its center dark and empty. The air was still, the silence heavy, but I could still feel it, the hum, faint and distant, threading through the ground, the air, the very fabric of the world. The frost on the trees was sharper now, its patterns more deliberate, more alive. And somewhere, faint and haunting, I thought I heard the sound of bells ringing. The first thing I noticed about Wintervale was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a snowy retreat, but something heavier, something unnatural. Even with the thick blanket of snow muffling every sound, the absence of noise felt deliberate, as though the world were holding its breath. The air was sharp, biting at my skin despite the layers of wool and fleece I'd wrapped around myself for the journey. The invitation had arrived weeks earlier, slipping through the mail slot without so much as a return address. Wintervale Christmas Retreat, a place of peace and reflection, it promised, accompanied by a glossy photograph of a grand lodge nestled in the heart of the Colorado Rockies. I should have ignored it. Instead, I found myself drawn to the promise of solitude, of escape, of leaving behind the chaos of the world, even if just for a few days. The drive was grueling, the narrow roads winding through forests that seemed to grow darker the deeper I ventured. My GPS gave out long before I reached the final stretch, leaving me to rely on the hand-drawn map included in the invitation. The lines were shaky, the landmarks vague, but somehow I found my way. When I reached the lodge, it was almost too perfect. The sprawling timber-framed building seemed to rise out of the snow, its peaked roof covered in icicles that glinted faintly in the pale afternoon light. Wreaths adorned every window, their green vibrant against the weathered wood, and strings of lights stretched across the porch, their glow soft and warm. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see on a holiday postcard, except for the shadows. They stretched long and sharp across the snow, darker than they should have been, their edges too defined, too deliberate. Inside, the air was warmer, but carried an oppressive weight that pressed against my chest. The lobby was grand, its high ceilings crisscrossed with wooden beams, a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. The decorations were meticulous, almost obsessive. Every garland was perfectly draped, every ornament carefully placed, every candle burning with a steady, unwavering flame. It should have felt inviting, but it didn't. There was something too precise about it all, as though someone had spent hours crafting an illusion of warmth, of safety. The other guests were already gathered by the fire, their laughter echoing faintly in the cavernous space. They seemed normal at first glance, well-dressed, polite, eager to engage in the kind of small talk that fills the gaps between strangers. But there was a tension beneath their smiles, a stiffness to their movements, as though they were performing a role rather than living it. I felt their eyes on me as I entered, their gazes lingering just a moment too long before flicking back to their drinks. The lodge's caretaker, Elias, appeared shortly after I arrived. He was tall and thin, his sharp features partially obscured by a thick scarf wrapped tightly around his neck. His voice carried the kind of authority that made you listen whether you wanted to or not. "Welcome to Wintervale," he said, his words deliberate, measured. "This retreat has been a tradition for generations. Here we honor the season, the light, and the balance it brings." His words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning I didn't understand. There was something in the way he said balance that made my stomach tighten, though I couldn't explain why. He gestured toward the Christmas tree standing in the corner of the room, its ornaments gleaming dully in the firelight. It was massive, its branches heavy with twisted baubles and garlands of dried flowers. Beneath it sat a collection of wrapped gifts, their paper dark green, their ribbons blood red. "The choir of lights begins tomorrow," Elias said, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. "Until then, I encourage you to rest and reflect. You will need your strength." I retreated to my room shortly after, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the lobby. My room was cozy, its walls lined with pine wood, the bed covered in a thick quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. The window overlooked the forest, its trees standing tall and still beneath the weight of the snow. I pulled the curtains closed, the shadows outside pressing against the glass like something alive. That night, the wind began to howl. At first, it was a low, mournful sound that threaded through the cracks in the walls, rattling the window panes. But as the hours stretched on, the sound changed. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was something deeper, something deliberate. Whispers threaded through the air, faint and indistinct, carrying a cadence that felt ancient, wrong. I pressed the pillow over my head, willing the sound to stop, but it didn't. It grew louder, sharper, threading through my thoughts like needles. Sleep came in fits and starts, my dreams fractured and suffocating. In them, I was standing in the forest, surrounded by towering pines that loomed darker and taller than they should have. The ground beneath my feet was covered in frost, its patterns intricate and unnatural, spiraling outward like veins. The whispers were there too, threading through the trees, growing louder, closer, until they were a roar that vibrated through my chest, my skull, my very being. I woke with a start, the room cold and still. The frost on the window had spread, its sharp edges carving patterns into the glass that mirrored the ones from my dream. My breath fogged the air as I sat up, my chest tight, my hands trembling. The whispers were gone, but the weight of their presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. Somewhere outside, deep in the forest, a sound rose, a single discordant note that hung in the air like a warning. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, and it was waiting. The next morning, the lodge was quieter than it had been the night before. The usual hum of early risers, clinking plates, and faint conversation was absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Even the fire in the grand fireplace seemed weaker, its flames licking at the logs without warmth. I lingered in my room longer than I intended, unable to shake the weight that had settled over me during the night. When I finally ventured downstairs, the other guests were gathered in the dining room. Their faces were pale, their movements slow and deliberate, like actors rehearsing a play they didn't fully understand. Plates of food sat untouched on the long wooden table, the smell of roasted ham and spiced potatoes thick in the air. No one looked up as I entered. Their eyes were downcast, their gazes fixed on the frost-covered windows. The frost had spread overnight, creeping inward from the edges of the glass like veins. Its patterns were intricate, almost beautiful, but there was something wrong about them, something alive. The sharp lines and spirals seemed deliberate, their shapes teasing at recognition before slipping away. The hum I had heard the night before was still there, faint but insistent, threading through the silence like a heartbeat. Elias appeared without warning, his tall frame looming in the doorway. His presence silenced what little conversation there was, his sharp eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made my chest tighten. He carried a stack of papers, their edges frayed and yellowed, and placed them on the table with deliberate care. "This is the schedule for the choir of lights," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Tonight, we begin with the first verse. Each of you has a part to play." His gaze lingered on me for a moment longer than the others, his expression unreadable. "You'll find your roles outlined here. Please prepare accordingly." I picked up one of the papers, its surface rough and weathered. The words were handwritten in an elegant but spidery script, their edges curling as though they'd been exposed to damp. My name was at the top, followed by a single word, harmony. Beneath it were instructions that made no sense, a series of symbols and phrases that didn't form coherent sentences. The longer I stared at them, the more the words seemed to shift, their shapes twisting into patterns that burned into my mind. I folded the paper quickly, shoving it into my pocket. The others were already leaving, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. I followed them out of the dining room, my chest tight, my breath shallow, the weight of the lodge pressing down on me with each step. The day passed in a haze. I wandered through the lodge, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, but it followed me everywhere. The frost-covered windows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, their patterns curling and twisting into shapes that mirrored the ones on the paper. The decorations that had once seemed festive now felt ominous, the garlands drooping under their own weight, the ornaments catching the dim light in ways that made my stomach churn. I found myself drawn to the library, its heavy oak door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was colder, the frost thicker, its patterns spreading across the shelves like ivy. The books were old, their spines cracked and faded, their titles worn to illegibility. I pulled one at random, its pages brittle beneath my fingers, and found myself staring at drawings of the same symbols that covered the windows. The text was in a language I didn't recognize, its sharp angles and jagged lines cutting into the yellowed pages. The hum grew louder as I turned the pages, its vibrations threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very being. The symbols seemed to glow faintly, their shapes shifting at the edges of my vision, forming patterns that teased at meaning before dissolving into chaos. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling, and placed it back on the shelf. The whispers started again that afternoon, threading through the halls of the lodge like smoke. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried weight, meaning, a cadence that pressed against my thoughts. They grew louder as the day stretched on, their tone sharp and urgent, threading through the hum like a second melody. The other guests seemed unaffected, their faces blank, their movements mechanical, but I could feel it, something was coming. When night fell, the air grew colder, the frost on the windows pulsing faintly in the dim light. The lodge was silent as Elias led us outside, his tall frame cutting through the snow like a shadow. The forest loomed ahead, its trees darker and denser than I remembered, their branches heavy with snow. The path we followed was lined with lanterns, their flames flickering weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The town square was eerily quiet. The massive Christmas tree at its center seemed taller than before, its twisted branches reaching toward the sky, its ornaments glinting faintly in the moonlight. The frost on its needles was sharper now, its patterns more intricate, threading through the garlands like veins. Beneath the tree, the snow was undisturbed, its surface smooth and pristine, as though no one had stepped there in years. Elias gestured for us to form a circle around the tree, his sharp eyes scanning the group. The hum was louder here, vibrating through the ground, threading through the air, pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. The frost beneath my feet pulsed faintly, its patterns twisting and shifting, their sharp edges catching the weak light of the lanterns. The ceremony began without warning. The others began to hum, their voices low and rhythmic, threading through the stillness like a chant. The sound wasn't harmonious, it was sharp, discordant, its cadence unnatural. The ornaments on the tree pulsed in time with the hum, their jagged shapes twisting and writhing, their reflections casting jagged shadows across the snow. I tried to hum along, but my voice faltered, the sound catching in my throat. The frost beneath my feet cracked, thin lines spreading outward like veins, the air around me growing sharper, colder, heavier. The whispers rose, threading through the chant, their tones sharp and urgent, pressing against my thoughts, my chest, my very being. The tree began to move. Its branches twisted and writhed, their sharp edges catching the light, their movements slow and deliberate. The ornaments detached themselves, floating upward, their sharp edges spinning, their shapes reflecting the flickering lantern light in ways that burned into my eyes. And then I saw the shadows. They rose from the ground, their forms twisting and writhing, their edges jagged and unnatural. They moved toward the tree, their movements slow and deliberate, their presence suffocating. The hum grew louder, sharper, threading through the air, vibrating through the ground, my chest, my very being. The last thing I remember was the frost spreading across the snow, its patterns sharp and angular, its edges glowing faintly in the moonlight. I woke to a cold so deep it felt like it had seeped into my bones. The frost that had crept across my window now lined the walls of my room, its intricate patterns curling into shapes that seemed deliberate. The symbols reminded me of the carvings I'd seen in the forest, their sharp lines twisting into spirals and angles that pressed against my mind like a forgotten memory. The hum from the night before hadn't left. It was quieter now, but insistent, threading through the silence like an unseen thread. Downstairs, the lodge was emptier than I expected. The other guests were absent, their usual half-hearted chatter replaced by an oppressive quiet. Even the fire in the grand hearth was barely alive, its flames weak, its embers glowing faintly. The decorations around the room felt heavier, their once festive charm overshadowed by the weight of the frost that now crept across their surfaces. I couldn't stay in the lodge. The air was too thick, the silence too suffocating. I bundled myself against the cold and stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The forest loomed ahead, its shadows stretching long and sharp across the snow, the trees darker and more foreboding than I remembered. The frost-covered path that led into the woods seemed to call to me, its lines sharp and glistening, threading through the snow like veins. I didn't mean to go far, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly, winding deeper into the forest with each step. The further I went, the colder it became, the air growing sharper, thinner, burning in my lungs. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground, threading through the trees, pressing against my chest like a second heartbeat. It was in the clearing that I found the first relic. A lantern stood in the center of the snow-covered expanse, its glass cracked, its metal frame rusted. It burned with a faint, flickering light that cast long shadows across the ground. Around it, the snow was untouched, pristine, as though no one had stepped here in years. The frost on the ground spiraled outward from the lantern, its patterns sharp and angular, threading through the snow like a web. As I approached, the hum grew louder, sharper, vibrating through my skull, my chest, my very being. The air around the lantern was colder, the metallic tang in the air sharper, burning in my throat. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the frost biting into my skin, the light flickering violently as my fingers brushed against the cold metal. The world shifted. The trees around the clearing twisted and writhed, their branches stretching toward the sky like claws. The shadows on the ground stretched and flickered, their edges jagged and unnatural. The lantern's light burned brighter, casting sharp, angular reflections across the frost-covered snow. And then, faintly, I heard it, a low, rhythmic chant threading through the hum, its cadence sharp and deliberate, pressing against my thoughts like a needle. I stumbled back, the lantern trembling in my hand, the frost beneath my feet cracking and splintering. The chant grew louder, threading through the forest, blending with the hum in a cacophony that made my head ache. The symbols in the frost seemed to shift, their lines twisting and writhing, forming shapes that teased at meaning before dissolving into chaos. The shadows moved. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the edge of my vision, a faint ripple across the snow. But as I turned, the movements became sharper, deliberate. The shadows rose from the ground, their forms twisting and stretching, their edges sharp and jagged. They moved toward me, their presence heavy, suffocating, the air around them growing colder, sharper, heavier. I ran. The path that had seemed endless before now felt impossibly narrow, the trees pressing in from all sides, their branches clawing at the sky. The shadows followed, their movements slow but deliberate, their forms flickering in and out of the frost-covered ground. The hum was deafening now, vibrating through the air, the ground, my chest, my very being. When I reached the lodge, the air was thick with frost, the windows covered in intricate patterns that mirrored the ones I'd seen in the forest. The decorations inside had changed. The garlands hung lower, their needles gray and brittle, the ornaments twisting and writhing, their sharp edges catching the faint light in unnatural ways. The Christmas tree in the parlor stood taller now, its branches reaching toward the ceiling, its ornaments pulsing faintly, their shapes sharp and angular. The other guests were gathered around the tree, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They moved in unison, their hands trembling as they placed objects beneath the tree. The gifts from the previous nights had been unwrapped, their contents scattered across the frost-covered floor, shards of glass, rusted keys, withered flowers. The hum vibrated through the room, pressing against my chest, threading through my thoughts like a needle. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, the air too sharp, too thin. The other guests didn't seem to notice me, their movements slow and mechanical, their eyes fixed on the ornaments that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The frost beneath the tree spread outward, its patterns twisting and shifting, forming symbols that burned into my mind. Elias appeared without a sound, his tall frame looming in the doorway. His presence silenced the faint murmurs of the other guests, his sharp eyes scanning the room. He held something in his hands, its shape obscured by the shadows that clung to him like a second skin. When he stepped forward, the shadows seemed to follow, threading through the frost, blending with the hum in a way that made my chest tighten. "The choir is nearly complete," he said, his voice low and deliberate, threading through the hum like a blade. "The final verse approaches." The room grew colder, the frost spreading across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. The ornaments on the tree pulsed brighter, their sharp edges casting jagged reflections across the frost-covered floor. The shadows that had followed me from the forest gathered at the edges of the room, their forms flickering, their movements deliberate. And somewhere in the distance, faint and haunting, I heard the sound of bells ringing. The frost had overtaken the lodge by the time the sun set. It crept along the walls, curling over every surface, transforming the wood and stone into something otherworldly. Even the fire in the hearth couldn't keep the chill at bay, its flames flickering weakly as if struggling against an unseen force. The hum was constant now, a low, rhythmic vibration threading through the air, the walls, the very floor beneath my feet. It had become impossible to ignore, pressing against my chest with every breath. The others seemed oblivious, their faces pale and vacant, their movements slow and deliberate. They drifted through the lodge like shadows, their eyes hollow, their expressions blank. None of them spoke, but their silence carried weight, as though they were waiting for something. I tried to avoid them, but their presence was everywhere, their quiet stillness more suffocating than any noise. I didn't want to go back to the forest, but the pull was undeniable. The frost-covered path that led into the trees seemed to call to me, its sharp patterns threading through the snow like veins, guiding me deeper into the shadows. The air was colder here, sharper, each breath burning in my lungs. The hum grew louder with every step, vibrating through the ground, threading through my thoughts like a needle. The trees pressed closer as I walked, their branches heavy with snow, their shadows long and jagged against the frost-covered ground. The path twisted and turned, leading me to places that felt impossibly far from the lodge. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of my boots against the frozen earth and the faint, discordant notes of the hum that threaded through the air. It was in the clearing that I found the altar. It rose from the ground like a jagged shard of ice, its surface covered in frost, its sharp edges catching the faint light that filtered through the trees. Symbols were etched into its surface, their sharp lines curling and twisting into patterns that mirrored the frost on the windows of the lodge. The hum was deafening here, vibrating through the air, the ground, my chest, my very being. The altar wasn't alone. Around it were relics, scattered across the snow like offerings. A broken mirror, its surface cracked and warped. A rusted lantern, its glass clouded with frost. A small, withered wreath, its once green leaves dry and brittle. Each one felt significant, as though they held meaning I couldn't quite grasp. As I stepped closer, the frost beneath my feet cracked, thin lines spreading outward like veins. The hum grew sharper, threading through my thoughts, pressing against my chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch the altar, the frost biting into my skin, its sharp edges cutting into my fingers. The world shifted. The trees around the clearing twisted and writhed, their branches stretching toward the sky like claws. The shadows on the ground flickered and stretched, their jagged edges cutting into the frost-covered earth. The symbols on the altar pulsed faintly, their sharp lines glowing with a pale, unnatural light that burned into my eyes. The hum rose to a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the air, rattling through my skull, my chest, my very thoughts. And then I saw it. The shadow rose from the ground, its form twisting and writhing, its edges jagged and unnatural. It towered over the altar, its limbs impossibly long, its movement slow and deliberate. Its face, or the absence of it, was a hollow void, dark and endless, pulling at the edges of the light, swallowing it whole. The hum vibrated through it, threading through the air, blending with the shadows in a way that made my chest tighten. The symbols on the altar pulsed brighter, their lines twisting into shapes that burned into my mind. The frost beneath the shadow cracked and splintered, thin lines spreading outward like veins, their sharp edges cutting through the snow. The air grew colder, sharper, heavier, each breath burning in my lungs, the metallic tang biting at the back of my throat. The shadow moved toward me, its presence suffocating, its limbs twisting and stretching, its jagged edges cutting through the air. The hum became a roar, vibrating through the clearing, threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very being. I stumbled backward, the frost beneath my feet cracking and splintering, the air around me growing colder, sharper, heavier. I don't know how I made it back to the lodge, but when I arrived, the frost had overtaken everything. The walls were covered in sharp, angular patterns that pulsed faintly in the dim light. The decorations were twisted and warped, their edges jagged, their shapes unnatural. The Christmas tree in the parlor stood taller than ever, its branches heavy with ornaments that glowed faintly, their sharp edges casting jagged reflections across the frost-covered floor. The others were gathered around the tree, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They moved in unison, their hands trembling as they placed objects beneath the tree. The hum vibrated through the room, blending with the whispers that threaded through the air like smoke. The frost beneath the tree cracked and splintered, thin lines spreading outward like veins, their sharp edges cutting through the floor. Elias appeared without a sound, his tall frame looming in the doorway. His presence silenced the faint murmurs of the others, his sharp eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made my chest tighten. He held something in his hands, its shape obscured by the shadows that clung to him like a second skin. When he stepped forward, the shadows seemed to follow, threading through the frost, blending with the hum in a way that made my chest tighten. "The time has come," he said, his voice low and deliberate, threading through the hum like a blade. "The choir is ready." The room grew colder, the frost spreading across the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The ornaments on the tree pulsed brighter, their sharp edges casting jagged reflections across the frost-covered floor. The shadows that had followed me from the forest gathered at the edges of the room, their forms flickering, their movements deliberate. And somewhere in the distance, faint and haunting, I heard the sound of bells ringing. The final night descended like a weight I couldn't escape. The frost had consumed the lodge, its sharp patterns carving into every surface, threading through the walls, ceilings, and floors like veins of something alive. Even the fire in the hearth was extinguished, its embers buried beneath a layer of ice. The air was sharp and metallic, burning in my lungs with every shallow breath. The hum had become unbearable, vibrating through the lodge, pressing against my chest, my thoughts, my very being. The others were already gathered when I entered the parlor. They stood in a circle around the Christmas tree, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. The tree was monstrous now, its twisted branches reaching the vaulted ceiling, its ornaments glowing faintly with a cold, unnatural light. The gifts beneath it had split open, their dark green paper shredded, revealing shadows that twisted and writhed, their sharp edges glinting in the dim light. Elias stood at the center of the room, his tall frame casting long, jagged shadows across the frost-covered floor. His hands were outstretched, his eyes fixed on the tree, his lips moving in a silent chant that threaded through the hum like a blade. The frost beneath him pulsed faintly, its patterns twisting and shifting, their sharp lines glowing with a pale, ghostly light. I wanted to turn back, to run, but my legs refused to move. The hum pressed against me, threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. The air grew heavier with each step as I approached the circle, the frost beneath my boots cracking and splintering, thin lines spreading outward like veins. The others didn't react to my presence, their blank faces fixed on the tree, their hands trembling as they clutched objects I couldn't see. Elias's voice rose above the hum, his words sharp and deliberate, their cadence cutting through the air like a knife. The symbols etched into the frost glowed brighter, their lines twisting into shapes that burned into my mind, their meaning pressing against my thoughts with a weight that made it hard to breathe. The ornaments on the tree pulsed violently, their sharp edges catching the faint light, their reflections casting jagged shadows across the room. The shadows moved. They rose from the ground, their forms twisting and writhing, their edges sharp and jagged. They gathered at the edges of the circle, their movements deliberate, their presence suffocating. The air grew colder, heavier, the metallic tang sharper, burning in my throat, my lungs. The hum became a roar, vibrating through the room, threading through the shadows, blending with Elias's chant and a cacophony that made my head ache. The tree began to change. Its branches twisted and writhed, their sharp edges cutting through the air, their movements slow and deliberate. The ornaments detached themselves, floating upward, their jagged edges spinning, casting distorted reflections across the frost-covered walls. The shadows moved toward the tree, their forms merging, twisting into a single towering mass of darkness that pulsed faintly, its edges flickering like smoke. And then it appeared. The silent watcher rose from the base of the tree, its form sharp and angular, its limbs impossibly long, its movements slow and deliberate. Its face, or the absence of it, was a hollow void, dark and endless, pulling at the edges of the light, swallowing it whole. The hum vibrated through it, threading through the air, blending with the shadows in a way that made my chest tighten. The others dropped to their knees, their heads bowed, their hands trembling as they raised their offerings to the watcher. Their movements were mechanical, their blank faces devoid of fear or recognition. The frost beneath them cracked and splintered, thin lines spreading outward like veins, their sharp edges cutting through the floor. The symbols etched into the walls glowed brighter, their lines twisting and shifting, forming patterns that seared into my thoughts. Elias turned to me, his sharp eyes gleaming with a cold, unnatural light. He held something in his hands, a small, black box wrapped in a blood-red ribbon. The hum vibrated through it, sharper now, threading through the room, pressing against my chest with a weight that made it hard to breathe. He stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate, the frost beneath his boots cracking and splintering with each step. "You are the soloist," he said, his voice low and deliberate, threading through the hum like a blade. "The final verse is yours to sing." The box was cold in my hands, its surface rough, its weight heavier than it should have been. The ribbon unraveled as I opened it, revealing a small, twisted shard of glass. It glowed faintly, its sharp edges catching the dim light, its surface reflecting something that wasn't me. The hum grew louder as I held it, vibrating through my chest, my thoughts, my very being. The silent watcher turned toward me, its hollow face tilting, its presence pressing against me like a physical weight. The frost beneath me cracked, thin lines spreading outward, their sharp edges cutting through the floor. The symbols on the walls pulsed violently, their lines twisting into shapes that burned into my mind. Elias's voice rose, sharp and commanding, threading through the hum like a blade. "Sing." The shard in my hand pulsed, its glow brighter, its sharp edges cutting into my skin. The hum became a roar, vibrating through the room, threading through my chest, my thoughts, my very soul. The frost beneath me spread, its patterns twisting and shifting, their sharp lines glowing with a pale, ghostly light. I opened my mouth, and the sound that came out wasn't mine. It was sharp and discordant, threading through the hum, blending with the shadows, cutting through the air like a blade. The room shook, the frost cracking and splintering, the tree twisting and writhing, its branches reaching toward the ceiling, its ornaments spinning violently. The silent watcher stepped closer, its limbs twisting, its hollow face consuming everything. The shadows writhed, their forms merging, their movements slow and deliberate. The frost beneath me pulsed one final time, its sharp edges cutting through the floor, the walls, the ceiling. And then there was silence. Just D. When I woke, the lodge was gone. The forest was silent, the snow untouched, the sky pale and empty. The frost beneath me had melted, its patterns erased, leaving only the faintest traces of what had been. The air was still, heavy with a presence that lingered, threading through the ground, the trees, the very fabric of the world. And somewhere, faint and haunting, I thought I heard the sound of bells ringing.